Hey everyone, tonight we venture into the hidden depths of the galaxy's greatest tragedy. The secret machinations that orchestrated the fall of the Jedi, the rise of the Empire, and the corruption of the Chosen One himself. This is the story of ancient Sith conspiracies that span millennia, of puppet masters pulling strings across time itself, and of truths so devastating they were buried beneath layers of myth and shadow. What you think you know about Revenge of the Sith is merely the surface. Tonight we uncover the real conspiracy that began long before Anakin's first breath and continues long after his redemption. But before we begin this journey into darkness and revelation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And here's something interesting. Over 90% of you who watch these stories regularly haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these deep dives into hidden galactic secrets, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow and reach more fellow seekers of forbidden knowledge. Also, if you're fascinated by the intricate political webs and ancient mysteries like those found in Game of Thrones, you'll want to check out my new channel, The Raven's Tales, where I explore the hidden depths of Westeros and beyond. You'll find the link in the description below. I'm genuinely curious about our community of truth seekers, so drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the galaxy. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected across different time zones, united by our hunger for these untold stories. Now settle into your most comfortable position, dim those lights, and let the soft hum of whatever background noise soothes you best become the soundtrack to tonight's revelation. In the depths of what was once the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, long after the Empire's fall, long after the New Republic's struggles, an archaeologist's torch flickered against walls that had witnessed the galaxy's greatest betrayal. The beam caught something that shouldn't exist, carved into stone that predated the Republic itself. Sith runes, ancient beyond measure, spelling out a single chilling phrase: the Chosen One's chains were forged before his conception. But this discovery was only the beginning. For in a hidden chamber beneath layers of rubble and forgotten history, a holocron waited. Not just any holocron, but one that contained the true architect's confession, a voice from beyond death, speaking truths that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about destiny, choice, and the careful orchestration of galactic tragedy. The archaeologist's hand trembled as the ancient device activated, projecting the spectral figure of a being whose very presence seemed to drain light from the surrounding darkness. The figure spoke in a voice like grinding stone, like the death of stars themselves. "Foolish Jedi. You believed you understood the prophecy. You thought the Chosen One would bring balance to the Force. But prophecies, like destinies, can be written by those with patience enough to wait centuries for their fulfillment. The Skywalker line was no accident. Anakin's fall was no tragedy. It was the culmination of a plan so vast, so intricate, that even my apprentice Sidious knew only fragments of its true scope." The holocron's light pulsed with malevolent energy as the figure continued. Every choice Anakin made, every moment of doubt, every surge of anger was carefully cultivated across generations. The Jedi Temple itself was built upon our ancient nexus of power, weakening their connection to the light side with each passing year. The Clone Wars were merely the final act of a play that began when the first Jedi drew their lightsaber. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the recording fractured, cutting off mid-revelation. The archaeologist was left in darkness, holding fragments of a truth so terrible that it challenged the very foundations of galactic history. For if the Chosen One's destiny was manufactured, if the rise and fall of the Empire was orchestrated across millennia, then what other truths lay buried in the galaxy's hidden corners? This is where our story truly begins. Not with the political machinations visible on the surface, but with the ancient puppet masters who viewed centuries as mere moments in their grand design. Tonight we follow the trail of evidence that leads from the deepest Sith tombs to the highest levels of Republic power, uncovering a conspiracy that makes the Emperor's rise seem like a simple political coup. We will discover how the Sith didn't simply hide in the shadows for 1,000 years, but actively shaped galactic civilization to serve their ultimate purpose. We will learn why the Jedi Temple was built where it was, why certain bloodlines were secretly preserved while others were eliminated, and why the clone army was designed not just to win a war, but to serve a purpose far more sinister than anyone imagined. But most disturbing of all, we will uncover evidence that the conspiracy didn't end with Palpatine's death, that the Sith Eternal, the hidden fleet on Exegol, the return of the Emperor himself, were all part of a plan so vast that it encompassed not just one galaxy, but multiple star systems across the known universe. So join me now, as we descend into the deepest mysteries of the Star Wars saga, as we uncover truths that the survivors of the Galactic Civil War never suspected, as we learn that the battle between light and dark was never a war at all, but a carefully orchestrated performance with a predetermined outcome. The truth is waiting. The question is, are you prepared to discover just how deep the deception goes? Our investigation begins now. Our tale unfolds in the final year before the Republic's fall, in the shadowed months of 19 BBY, when the Clone Wars raged across 1,000 worlds. But our story does not begin in the gleaming Senate chambers or the sterile corridors of star destroyers. Instead, it takes us deep beneath the surface of Coruscant itself, into the forgotten levels where the city planet's ancient foundations still whisper of older civilizations. Here, in the subterranean archives that few Jedi ever knew existed, worked an unlikely seeker of truth. You are Kael Jorik, a Force-sensitive archivist who served not in the grand halls of the Jedi Temple above, but in the restricted collections buried beneath the city's endless sprawl. Your gift with the Force was subtle, manifesting not in lightsaber combat or telekinetic displays, but in an almost supernatural ability to sense the connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. For months you had been tracking what the Jedi Council dismissed as mere clerical errors. Battle reports that contained impossible timeline discrepancies, communications between Republic commanders that referenced military strategies not yet developed. Most disturbing of all, fragments of ancient Sith texts that kept appearing in the most unlikely places, as if the galaxy's dark history was slowly bleeding through the careful layers of civilized forgetting. The chamber where you worked was a marvel of hidden engineering. Carved from the living rock of Coruscant's foundation, its walls stretched upward into darkness that seemed to swallow even the brightest glow rods. Ancient shelves lined every available surface, groaning under the weight of holocrons, data cards, and physical books that predated the Republic itself. The air here carried the scent of age and secrets, of knowledge that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. But you were not alone in this subterranean sanctuary. Your companion in these investigations was Master Lyra Voss, a former apprentice of the legendary Jocasta Nu, who had chosen to dedicate her life to the preservation of dangerous knowledge. Where other Jedi sought to destroy Sith artifacts, Master Voss believed that understanding the enemy required studying their methods, their history, their long-game strategies that spanned centuries. She was a woman of perhaps 60 standard years, her silver hair bound in simple braids that spoke of practical priorities over ceremonial appearance. Her eyes held the weight of secrets, and when she moved through the archives, it was with the careful grace of someone who had learned to tread lightly around dangerous truths. Most importantly, she possessed security clearances that granted access to records the Jedi Council had sealed away from their own members. The deeper archives stretched for kilometers in every direction, a vast honeycomb of chambers and corridors that mapped the forgotten history of 1,000 civilizations. Some rooms contained the last fragments of worlds that had been destroyed in ancient wars. Others held prophecies and warnings that had been deemed too dangerous for general circulation. And in the deepest vaults, behind locks that required both technological keys and force techniques to open, lay the collected knowledge of the Sith themselves. It was here, in these forbidden depths, that you first began to notice the patterns. Technologies that appeared in both Republic and Separatist databases despite being classified at the highest levels. Communication frequencies that linked to star systems that officially did not exist. Most troubling of all, genetic markers in clone trooper medical records that matched profiles from ancient Sith bloodline research. The Force itself seemed different down here in the deep archives. The familiar warmth and guidance that characterized the light side was muted, filtered through layers of rock and time and accumulated darkness. But there was something else, a presence that seemed to move through the shadows between the stacks of ancient knowledge. Not malevolent exactly, but watchful, as if the archives themselves were aware of your investigations and were either helping or hindering your progress according to some agenda you could not yet comprehend. Your workstation occupied a natural alcove in the chamber's eastern wall, surrounded by the tools of your trade, modified holocron readers that could decipher languages lost to time, quantum encryption devices that could break through security protocols dating back to the old Republic, and most importantly, a collection of force-focusing crystals that helped amplify your natural ability to sense connections and patterns that others might miss. It was during one of these deep focusing sessions that you first encountered the temporal anomalies. Records that seemed to shift and change when viewed through the Force, as if multiple versions of history were competing for dominance in the same databank. Battle reports from the Clone Wars that contained references to events that had not yet occurred. Strategic analyses that discussed the effectiveness of weapons systems that were still in the theoretical design phase. Master Voss had been studying these anomalies for months before bringing you into the investigation. She suspected that someone or something was deliberately altering historical records in real time. Not just editing them, but fundamentally changing the past itself through methods that traditional archival science could not explain or detect. The evidence was subtle, but consistent. A communication here, a supply manifest there, a personnel transfer that created a chain of seemingly unrelated events. But when viewed through the Force, when you allowed your consciousness to expand beyond linear time and conventional causality, the pattern became clear. Every altered record, every temporal inconsistency, every impossible piece of information pointed toward a single terrifying conclusion. The Clone Wars were not the chaotic conflict they appeared to be. They were the final phase of a plan that had been in motion for centuries, guided by intelligence that operated outside the normal flow of time and space. And somewhere in the deepest archives, hidden beneath layers of misdirection and false history, lay the proof that would expose the true orchestrators of the galaxy's greatest tragedy. But first, you would have to survive the journey into the darkest corners of galactic history, where ancient Sith Lords still whispered their secrets to those foolish enough to listen. The decision to leave the safety of the archives came not through careful planning, but through the arrival of a single encrypted message that changed everything. Master Voss had been monitoring secure Republic channels when the transmission arrived, its origin masked by routing protocols that shouldn't have existed in any known communication system. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. The Ryloth facility holds the first piece. The clone modifications were never about the war. Find the genetic templates before they are moved to the secondary site. Time is running short. The final phase begins with Order 66. The sender's identity remained hidden behind layers of encryption that even Master Voss's considerable skills could not penetrate. that the message contained verification codes that proved it had originated from within the highest levels of Republic intelligence. More disturbing still, the timestamp on the message indicated it had been sent 3 days before the Battle of Ryloth had even begun. You felt the weight of destiny settling around your shoulders like a heavy cloak as you prepared for the journey ahead. The comfortable certainty of the archives, with their carefully catalogued mysteries and controlled revelations, was about to give way to something far more dangerous. Out there in the galaxy torn apart by war, the conspiracy you had been tracking through ancient texts and temporal anomalies was revealing itself in real time. Master Voss moved through the preparation process with the efficiency of someone who had undertaken such missions before. She gathered specialized equipment from the archive's most secure vaults, a portable holocron reader capable of interfacing with systems across multiple technological eras, data storage devices that could hold terabytes of information while remaining undetectable to standard security scans, and most importantly, authentication codes that would grant access to facilities that officially did not exist. The journey to Ryloth would require careful planning. The Twice homeworld had become a strategic flashpoint in the Clone Wars, with both Republic and Separatist forces maintaining a significant presence in the system. The facility mentioned in the message was located on the planet's dark side, in a region that had been declared off-limits to all non-essential personnel. Getting there would require not just transportation, but the kind of cover story that would satisfy both Republic security and Separatist intelligence. As you prepared to leave the archives for the first time in months, you became acutely aware of how the Force itself seemed to be shifting around you. The familiar presence that had guided your research in the depths below was becoming something else, something that spoke of ancient prophecies and predetermined paths. It was as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next movement in a game that had been playing out for millennia. The transport that would carry you to Ryloth was a modified Republic intelligence vessel, its hull scarred by multiple battles and its registry carefully altered to suggest it belonged to an independent cargo hauler. The captain, a grizzled veteran named Thane who asked no questions about his passengers or their destination, had been flying these kinds of missions since the war began. His ship, the Wanderer's Rest, carried the kind of sensor-dampening equipment that would allow it to slip through contested space without attracting unwanted attention. During the hyperspace journey to Ryloth, Master Voss shared information that she had been keeping classified even from you. The Republic's intelligence network had been detecting anomalies for months, but the pattern was only now becoming clear. Research facilities that appeared in budget allocations but had no official purpose. Personnel transfers that moved scientists and technicians to locations that were not supposed to exist. And most disturbing of all, genetic research projects that seemed to be drawing from biological samples that predated the Clone Wars by decades. The evidence suggested that someone had been preparing for this conflict long before the first shots were fired at Geonosis. The clone army that had appeared so conveniently to save the Republic was only the most visible part of a much larger operation. Hidden facilities across the galaxy were conducting research that went far beyond military applications. They were studying the Force itself, looking for ways to enhance it, control it, and ultimately corrupt it for purposes that remained unclear. As the Wanderer's Rest dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Ryloth system, you felt the first stirrings of what would become a recurring sensation throughout your investigation. The Force was different here, touched by currents of darkness that seemed to flow beneath the surface of normal space-time. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been subtly altered, creating channels through which malevolent influences could flow. The planet Ryloth hung before you like a jewel of perpetual twilight, its tidally locked surface creating a sharp division between the scorching day side and the frozen night side. The facility you sought was located in the narrow band of habitable terrain between these extremes, hidden within a canyon system that provided natural protection from both the planet's harsh environment and unwanted surveillance. Captain Thane guided his ship through the atmospheric entry with the skill of someone who had performed similar insertions countless times before. The Wanderer's Rest descended through layers of turbulent air currents, its sensors probing ahead for signs of separatist patrol craft or Republic security sweeps. The canyon system appeared on the ship's displays as a maze of interconnected passages carved into the planet's surface by millions of years of geological activity. The facility itself was a marvel of hidden engineering. Built into the canyon walls themselves, its presence was almost impossible to detect from above. Only the subtle variations in thermal signatures and the occasional glint of reflected light from concealed viewport revealed its existence. As you approached the designated landing coordinates, you could see that the facility was far larger than the intelligence reports had suggested. It stretched for kilometers through the canyon system, its various sections connected by tunnels that had been carved through solid rock. The landing pad where Captain Thane set down his ship was one of several that had been built into natural alcoves in the canyon walls. Each pad was equipped with concealment systems that would hide any vessel from orbital surveillance. The level of sophistication suggested that this was no temporary installation, but a permanent base of operations that had been under construction for years. As you and Master Voss disembarked from the Wanderer's Rest, you were met by a figure who identified himself as Dr. Kael, the facility's research coordinator. He was a human male of middle years, his appearance unremarkable, except for the kind of alert intelligence that characterized career scientists. But there was something else about him, a subtle wrongness that made your Force senses recoil. He carried the taint of dark side corruption, though he seemed unaware of it himself. Dr. Naller explained that the facility had been established to conduct research into what he called enhanced soldier development. The official purpose was to improve the effectiveness of clone troopers through genetic modifications and behavioral conditioning. But as he led you through the facility's main corridors, you began to sense that the true purpose was something far more sinister. The corridors themselves were a study in contrasts. The main passages were brightly lit and efficiently designed, with the clean lines and functional aesthetics typical of Republic military construction. But the side passages that branched off from the main routes led to areas that felt different, places where the Force itself seemed to recoil from whatever activities were being conducted behind heavily sealed doors. Dr. Nallar's tour of the facility was carefully controlled, designed to show you only what he wanted you to see. But your enhanced senses picked up details that he was trying to hide. The sound of machinery that seemed to pulse with organic rhythms, the smell of chemicals that suggested biological experimentation on a massive scale, and most disturbing of all, the psychic echoes of pain and fear that seemed to emanate from the facility's deeper levels. It was in the main laboratory complex that you first encountered direct evidence of the conspiracy that had drawn you across the galaxy. Banks of genetic sequencing equipment lined the walls, their displays showing DNA patterns that seemed to shift and change as you watched. But these were not the simple genetic profiles of clone troopers. These were complex biological maps that incorporated elements from multiple species, including genetic markers that you recognized from your studies of ancient Sith bloodlines. Master Voss examined the research data with the careful attention of someone who understood the implications of what they were seeing. The genetic templates stored in the facility's databases represented years of careful breeding and selection, bloodlines that had been preserved across generations, their Force sensitivity enhanced through techniques that bordered on Sith alchemy, and most disturbing of all, evidence that these templates were being used to create something that went far beyond simple soldier enhancement. The clone modifications that Dr. Nallar described as battlefield improvements were actually complex neurological alterations designed to make the subjects more susceptible to external control. The famous loyalty and obedience of the clone troopers was not a natural result of their accelerated development, but the product of careful psychological conditioning that could be activated through specific trigger protocols. As you delved deeper into the facility's databases, you began to understand the true scope of what was being attempted. The clone army was not just a military force, but a test platform for techniques that could be applied to the general population. The genetic modifications being developed here could be deployed through food supplies, medical treatments, or even atmospheric distribution systems. The entire Republic could be transformed into a population of willing servants, their free will replaced by unquestioning obedience to whoever controlled the activation protocols. But the most disturbing discovery came when you accessed the facility's communication logs. The research being conducted at Ryloth was not an isolated project, but part of a vast network of similar facilities spread across the galaxy. Each site was working on different aspects of the same ultimate goal, their efforts coordinated by a central authority that remained hidden behind layers of security and misdirection. The communications themselves were encrypted using techniques that seemed to incorporate elements of ancient Sith sorcery. The mathematical algorithms were based on principles that should not have existed in the current technological framework. It was as if someone had combined cutting-edge science with mystical knowledge that predated the Republic by thousands of years. As you and Master Voss prepared to leave the facility with the evidence you had gathered, you became aware that your investigation had not gone unnoticed. Dr. Nala's demeanor had changed subtly, his previous cooperation replaced by a watchful tension that suggested he was receiving instructions from sources beyond the facility. The very air around you seemed to thicken with malevolent attention, as if ancient eyes were turning their gaze toward your small party of investigators. The journey back to the Wanderer's Rest was conducted in tense silence, each of you aware that the evidence you now carried made you targets of forces that would stop at nothing to preserve their secrets. The genetic templates and communication logs in your possession represented only the first piece of a puzzle that was far larger and more dangerous than either of you had imagined. As Captain Thane lifted his ship away from Ryloth and set course for the next phase of your investigation, you found yourself staring out at the stars and wondering how many other worlds harbored similar secrets. The galaxy that had seemed so familiar from your studies in the archives was revealing itself to be a place of hidden depths and ancient conspiracies where the very foundations of civilization had been quietly undermined by patient and malevolent intelligence. The evidence from Ryloth was clear. The Clone Wars were not what they appeared to be. They were the final act in a drama that had been written long before the first clone drew breath, and the script called for the complete transformation of galactic civilization under the control of forces that remained hidden in shadow. The journey from Ryloth to your next destination brought revelations that fundamentally altered your understanding of the galaxy's recent history. As the Wanderer's Rest traveled through hyperspace toward the Camino system, you and Master Voss spent countless hours analyzing the data recovered from the hidden facility. What you discovered in those encrypted files would have been dismissed as impossible by any conventional investigator, but the Force itself seemed to confirm the terrible truth contained within those digital records. The genetic templates you had recovered were not simply modifications to existing clone trooper designs. They were blueprints for an entirely new form of life, one that combined the most effective elements of multiple species with enhancements that drew upon knowledge that should have been lost to time. The biological engineering represented in these files was centuries ahead of anything the Republic's scientists should have been capable of achieving, yet the timestamps on the research indicated it had been ongoing for decades. Master Voss had seen similar techniques before in her studies of ancient Sith texts that described the creation of artificial life forms through the manipulation of midi-chlorians and the corruption of natural life processes. The genetic modifications being developed at the Ryloth facility bore striking similarities to these forbidden practices, as if someone had taken the theoretical knowledge of Sith alchemy and applied it using modern technological methods. But the most disturbing aspect of the genetic research was its scope. The facility on Ryloth was clearly part of a much larger network, with communication logs indicating regular data exchanges with installations across the galaxy. Each facility seemed to be working on specific aspects of the same ultimate project, their efforts coordinated by a central authority that remained hidden behind layers of encryption and misdirection. The communication protocols themselves were a marvel of sophisticated paranoia. Messages were routed through multiple relay stations, their content encrypted using algorithms that incorporated elements of ancient Sith mysticism alongside cutting-edge mathematical principles. The security measures were so comprehensive that even Master Voss's considerable skills could only penetrate the outer layers of the protective systems. What you could decipher painted a picture of an organization that had been planning for the current conflict long before the first shots were fired at Geonosis. References to Phase 1 implementation and accelerated timeline protocols suggested that the Clone Wars themselves were not an unexpected development, but a carefully orchestrated event that served purposes beyond simple military victory. The genetic modifications being developed were not limited to clone troopers. The research files contained extensive studies of the general population's genetic profiles, with particular attention paid to Force-sensitive bloodlines. It appeared that someone had been conducting a galaxy-wide survey of genetic diversity, identifying specific traits that could be enhanced, suppressed, or eliminated according to some predetermined criteria. As you studied these files, you began to notice patterns that connected to your earlier research in the archives. Certain genetic markers that appeared in the Ryloth data matched profiles you had encountered in ancient Sith texts describing the creation of specialized servants and warriors. The bloodlines being tracked included not just obvious targets like the Jedi, but also merchant families, political dynasties, and even seemingly random individuals whose genetic heritage contained elements that the researchers found significant. The scope of the surveillance was staggering. The organization behind these facilities had been monitoring the population of the entire galaxy for generations, tracking genetic changes across multiple species and recording the results with scientific precision. The data indicated that they had been selectively influencing breeding patterns through economic incentives, political arrangements, and even manufactured conflicts that brought specific bloodlines into contact with each other. The implications were horrifying. If the genetic modifications being developed could be deployed on a galactic scale, the entire population could be transformed into a more easily controlled form of life. The research suggested that the modifications could be introduced through food supplies, medical treatments, or even atmospheric distribution systems. Within a generation, the citizens of the Republic could be reduced to willing servants, their capacity for independent thought replaced by unquestioning obedience to whoever controlled the activation protocols. But the genetic research was only one aspect of the conspiracy that the Ryloth data revealed. The communication logs contained references to archaeological expeditions that had been conducted at sites across the galaxy, many of them locations that were officially restricted or entirely secret. These expeditions appeared to be searching for specific artifacts that were described in terms that suggested they were related to ancient Sith technology or mystical practices. The archaeological data was particularly disturbing because it indicated that the organization had been active for far longer than the genetic research suggested. Some of the expedition reports dated back decades, describing the recovery of artifacts from sites that had been lost to galactic civilization for thousands of years. The recovered items were described in clinical terms that revealed little about their true nature, but the security classifications assigned to them suggested they were considered extremely dangerous. Master Voss recognized several of the archaeological sites from her studies of ancient Sith history. The locations mentioned in the reports included some of the most significant centers of dark side power in the galaxy, places where the ancient Sith had conducted their most forbidden experiments and rituals. The fact that these sites were being systematically excavated by the same organization that was conducting genetic research suggested a level of coordination and long-term planning that was almost incomprehensible. The expedition reports also contained references to the recovery of what were described as instructional materials from these ancient sites. The nature of these materials was not specified, but the security protocols surrounding them suggested they contained information that was considered both valuable and extremely dangerous. The materials were being transported to secure facilities for study and analysis, with the results being integrated into the genetic research projects. As you analyzed the data from Ryloth, you began to understand that you were looking at evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back not just years or decades, but potentially millennia. The organization behind these facilities had access to knowledge and resources that should have been lost to time, and they were using this ancient wisdom to pursue goals that seemed to involve the complete transformation of galactic civilization. The Force itself seemed to respond to your growing understanding of the conspiracy's scope. During your meditation sessions aboard the Wanderer's Rest, you found yourself experiencing visions that seemed to connect the present conflict to events that had occurred in the distant past. You saw ancient Sith Lords conducting rituals that spanned centuries, their consciousness preserved through techniques that allowed them to guide events across vast periods of time. These visions suggested that the conspiracy was not being directed by contemporary individuals, but by intelligences that had somehow survived from the ancient past. The knowledge being applied to the genetic research projects was not the result of recent discoveries, but the careful application of wisdom that had been preserved through methods that transcended normal concepts of life and death. The implications of this realization were staggering. If ancient Sith consciousness had somehow survived and was directing current events, then the Republic was facing an enemy that possessed knowledge and resources accumulated over thousands of years. The Clone Wars were not a simple political conflict, but the latest phase in a struggle that had been ongoing since the founding of the Jedi Order itself. The data from Ryloth also contained evidence that the conspiracy's influence extended far beyond the genetic research facilities. Communication logs referenced coordination protocols with various political and military organizations, suggesting that the conspiracy had agents placed throughout the Republic's governmental and military structures. The extent of this infiltration was not specified, but the security measures surrounding the communications suggested that it was both extensive and highly successful. As you prepared to investigate the next phase of the conspiracy, you became aware that your own activities had not gone unnoticed. The data from Ryloth contained references to external investigation protocols and containment procedures that suggested the organization was aware of efforts to uncover their activities. The fact that these protocols existed indicated that you were not the first to stumble upon evidence of the conspiracy, and the clinical nature of the containment procedures suggested that previous investigators had not survived their discoveries. The journey to Kamino would provide the next piece of the puzzle, but you were beginning to understand that each revelation would likely raise more questions than it answered. The conspiracy you were investigating was not a simple plot that could be unraveled through conventional investigative techniques. It was a vast, multi-generational undertaking that incorporated elements of science, mysticism, and political manipulation on a scale that challenged the very foundations of galactic civilization. The genetic templates recovered from Ryloth were just the beginning. The communication logs suggested that the clone army was only the first phase of a much larger transformation that would eventually encompass every aspect of galactic society. The ancient knowledge being applied to these projects came from sources that predated the Republic itself, and the goals being pursued seemed to involve nothing less than the complete rewriting of the galaxy's biological and political structure. As the Wanderer's Rest approached the Kamino system, you found yourself wondering whether the investigation you had begun would ultimately prove to be humanity's salvation or its doom. The knowledge you were uncovering was dangerous not just because of what it revealed about the conspiracy, but because of what it suggested about the nature of the galaxy itself. If ancient Sith consciousness could survive across millennia and manipulate events on such a vast scale, then the very concepts of free will and individual choice might be nothing more than carefully maintained illusions. The evidence from Ryloth had shown you that the clone army was not what it appeared to be. The genetic modifications being developed were not improvements, but control mechanisms designed to transform living beings into willing servants. The question now was whether these techniques were being applied only to the clones, or whether they were part of a larger plan that would eventually encompass every citizen of the Republic. The answers to these questions lay waiting in the cloning facilities of Kamino, where the Republic's army was being grown in vast production chambers that stretched beneath the planet's storm-swept oceans. But as you prepared to descend into those depths, you could not shake the feeling that you were walking into a trap that had been set long before your investigation began. The storm-swept world of Kamino emerged from hyperspace like a vision from a fever dream, its endless oceans churning beneath perpetual tempests that had raged for millennia. As the Wanderer's Rest descended through the planet's turbulent atmosphere, you felt the Force itself shifting around you, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched and warped by the activities taking place in the depths below. The journey to Kamino had been filled with careful analysis of the data recovered from Ryloth, and by the time you arrived at the cloning world, you and Master Voss had developed what seemed to be a comprehensive understanding of the conspiracy you were investigating. The evidence appeared to point toward a clear and horrifying conclusion that made sense of all the disparate pieces you had uncovered. The genetic research facilities, the archaeological expeditions, the infiltration of Republic governmental structures, all of it seemed to be part of a vast separatist operation that had been decades in the making. The Confederate independent systems had not simply chosen to rebel against the Republic, they had been systematically undermining galactic civilization from within, using techniques that combined cutting-edge science with ancient Sith knowledge to achieve their goals. This explanation felt satisfying in its completeness. It accounted for the advanced technology that should not have existed, the genetic modifications that drew upon forbidden knowledge, and the coordination between facilities that spanned the galaxy. The Separatists had clearly been planning this war for far longer than anyone had suspected, and their ultimate goal was not just political independence, but the complete transformation of galactic civilization under their control. Master Voss had initially shared your confidence in this analysis. The evidence from Ryloth seemed to support the conclusion that the Clone Wars were not the chaotic conflict they appeared to be, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to weaken the Republic while the Separatists implemented their long-term transformation agenda. The genetic modifications being developed would allow them to control not just the clone army, but eventually the entire population of the galaxy. But as you delved deeper into the cloning facilities of Kamino, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge that challenged this seemingly logical explanation. The Kaminoans themselves, the master cloners who had created the Republic's army, displayed a level of nervous tension that seemed out of proportion to the simple presence of Republic investigators. Their responses to your questions were carefully rehearsed, as if they had been prepared for exactly this type of inquiry. The cloning facilities themselves were a marvel of biological engineering that stretched for kilometers beneath Kamino's storm-lashed surface. Vast chambers filled with growth tanks contained millions of developing clones, their genetic development accelerated through techniques that the Kaminos claimed were proprietary innovations. But your Force-enhanced senses detected something else in those sterile halls, a presence that seemed to watch and evaluate every aspect of the cloning process. The official tour of the facilities was conducted by Lama Siu, the Prime Minister of Kamino, whose elongated features and careful speech patterns suggested a being who was accustomed to concealing as much as he revealed. He spoke proudly of the clone army's capabilities, describing the various enhancements and modifications that had been incorporated into their genetic structure. But there was something in his manner that suggested he was not revealing the full extent of what the cloning facilities were capable of producing. It was during a moment when the official tour had paused for what Lama Su described as a routine security check that you first noticed the deeper inconsistencies in the separatist conspiracy theory. While examining the genetic databases that contained the templates for clone production, you discovered records that predated the official beginning of the Clone Army project by several years. These early records contained genetic profiles that seemed to be derived from sources other than Jango Fett, including biological samples that appeared to come from individuals whose genetic heritage included Force-sensitive bloodlines. The implications were disturbing. If the Kaminos had been conducting genetic research using Force-sensitive subjects before the official Clone Army project began, then someone had been planning for this conflict long before the Battle of Geonosis. But the temporal inconsistencies went even deeper than that. Some of the genetic profiles in the early records seemed to incorporate elements that matched the ancient Sith bloodline markers you had encountered in your archival research. Master Voss was examining the cloning facility's communication systems when she made a discovery that fundamentally challenged the separatist conspiracy theory. The secure communication channels that connected Kamino to the broader galaxy contained message logs that revealed regular contact with Republic governmental offices, but the communication protocols were far more sophisticated than anything the separatists should have been capable of developing. The encryption methods used in these communications incorporated mathematical principles that seemed to draw upon knowledge that predated the Republic itself. The algorithms were based on concepts that you recognized from ancient Sith texts, describing the manipulation of probability and the engineering of seemingly random events. It was as if someone had taken mystical knowledge from the distant past and applied it to modern information security techniques. But the most disturbing aspect of the communication logs was their content. The messages that Master Voss was able to partially decrypt contained references to coordination protocols that extended far beyond the scope of separatist activities. The communications mentioned Phase 2 implementation schedules and post-conflict transition procedures that suggested the Clone Wars were not the ultimate goal of the conspiracy, but merely a preliminary step in a much larger transformation. The genetic modification research being conducted at Kamino was far more extensive than the official Clone Army project suggested. Hidden laboratories deep within the facility were working on biological enhancements that went far beyond simple soldier improvements. The research files contained studies of neural modification techniques that could be applied to any biological organism, regardless of species or genetic heritage. These modifications were designed to enhance susceptibility to external control while maintaining the appearance of normal cognitive function. The subjects would retain their memories, personalities, and apparent free will, but their decision-making processes would be subtly influenced by external signals that could be transmitted through a variety of technological and mystical means. The scope of this research suggested that the ultimate goal was not just the control of the Clone Army, but the gradual transformation of the entire galactic population into a more easily managed form of life. The techniques being developed could be deployed through medical treatments, food additives, or even atmospheric distribution systems. Within a generation, every citizen of the Republic could be transformed into a willing servant, their capacity for independent thought replaced by unquestioning obedience to whoever controlled the modification protocols. But as you and Master Voss continued your investigation of the Kamino facilities, you began to encounter evidence that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the separatist conspiracy theory. The research being conducted was clearly coordinated with similar facilities across the galaxy, but the communication protocols suggested that the coordination was being managed by an authority that was not affiliated with the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The temporal inconsistencies in the research records were particularly troubling. Some of the genetic modification techniques being developed at Kamino appeared to be based on experimental data that had been collected decades before the Clone Wars began. The research had been ongoing for far longer than the separatist movement had existed, suggesting that it was being directed by an organization that had been planning for this conflict since before the current political crisis emerged. The Force itself seemed to respond to your growing doubts about the separatist conspiracy theory. During meditation sessions in the depths of the cloning facility, you found yourself experiencing visions that seemed to contradict the logical explanation you had developed. You saw ancient figures moving through the corridors of the facility, their presence somehow timeless and eternal. These visions suggested that the conspiracy was being directed not by contemporary political movements, but by intelligences that had somehow survived from the distant past. Master Voss was experiencing similar doubts about the conclusions you had reached. Her examination of the facility's security systems had revealed evidence of surveillance protocols that were far more sophisticated than anything the Separatists should have been capable of implementing. The monitoring systems were designed to track not just physical activities, but Force-sensitive individuals and their interactions with the facility's various research projects. The Kaminoans themselves seemed to be operating under constraints that extended beyond simple business relationships with their Republic clients. Their behavior suggested they were following protocols that had been established by an authority that remained hidden from view. When questioned about certain aspects of the cloning process, they would defer to security considerations that were never clearly explained. It was during a private conversation with one of the facility's research scientists that you first heard direct reference to the deeper conspiracy. Nala C., a Kaminoan who had been involved in the Clone Army project since its inception, spoke carefully about external coordination requirements and long-term development protocols that suggested the cloning facilities were part of a much larger organizational structure. Dr. Nala C's comments were carefully phrased to avoid direct statements about the true nature of the conspiracy, but her manner suggested that she was aware of activities that extended far beyond the official Clone Army project. When pressed for more specific information, she would reference classification levels and security protocols that prevented her from providing details about the facility's true purpose. The genetic databases contained references to research subjects that were described only through coded identifiers, but the biological profiles suggested that the Kaminoans had been working with genetic samples from individuals whose Force sensitivity was extremely high. Some of these profiles seemed to match the characteristics of ancient Sith bloodlines, while others appeared to be derived from Jedi or other Force-sensitive species. The implications were staggering. If the cloning facilities were being used to develop techniques for controlling Force-sensitive individuals, then the conspiracy was targeting not just the general population, but the very beings who might be capable of detecting and opposing the manipulation. The genetic modifications being developed could potentially be used to neutralize the Jedi Order's ability to sense disturbances in the Force. But the most disturbing discovery came when you accessed the facility's deepest research archives. Hidden behind multiple layers of security and misdirection, you found evidence of experiments that incorporated elements of ancient Sith alchemy alongside modern genetic engineering techniques. The research was attempting to create biological organisms that could serve as vessels for consciousness that existed independently of normal physical forms. The experiments were described in clinical terms that revealed little about their true purpose, but the security classifications assigned to them suggested they were considered extremely dangerous. The research was being conducted in isolation chambers that were shielded not just from physical intrusion, but from Force-based detection methods as well. As you prepared to leave Kamino with this new evidence, you found yourself questioning every assumption you had made about the conspiracy you were investigating. The separatist theory that had seemed so logical and complete was beginning to collapse under the weight of evidence that pointed towards something far more ancient and far more dangerous than a simple political rebellion. The genetic modifications being developed at Kamino were not just weapons in a contemporary conflict, but tools for implementing a transformation that had been planned for millennia. The conspiracy you were investigating was not being directed by the Confederacy of Independent Systems, but by intelligences that had somehow survived from the ancient past and were now using the Clone Wars as a vehicle for achieving goals that predated the Republic itself. The evidence from Camino suggested that the clone army was not just a military force, but a test platform for techniques that would eventually be applied to the entire galactic population. The genetic modifications being developed could be deployed on a scale that would transform every citizen of the Republic into a more easily controlled form of life, their capacity for independent thought replaced by unquestioning obedience to whoever controlled the modification protocols. But as you departed from the storm-swept world of Camino, you carried with you the growing realization that the conspiracy you were investigating was far more complex and dangerous than you had initially understood. The separatist explanation had been satisfying in its completeness, but the evidence was pointing toward a truth that was both more ancient and more terrifying than anything you had imagined. The journey from Camino took you deeper into the galaxy's hidden heart, to places where the very foundations of civilized space gave way to older, darker truths. Your destination was a system that officially did not exist, erased from star charts by authorities whose identities remained classified at the highest levels of Republic security. The coordinates had been extracted from the deepest layers of the Camino facility's encrypted communications, hidden beneath protocols that suggested they were more valuable than the cloning research itself. As the Wanderer's Rest navigated through hyperspace routes that required constant course corrections to avoid detection, you found yourself experiencing meditation sessions that revealed disturbing patterns in the Force itself. The familiar currents of light and dark that characterized normal space seemed to be flowing in directions that defied conventional understanding. It was as if the galaxy's mystical energies were being channeled toward specific destinations by mechanisms that operated beyond the reach of traditional Jedi techniques. Master Voss had been studying the astronomical data recovered from Camino, and her analysis revealed that the hidden system you were approaching occupied a position that was significant in ways that extended far beyond simple strategic considerations. The system's location corresponded to ancient star charts that had been discovered in Sith ruins, charts that mapped what the ancient texts described as nexus points, where the Force itself could be manipulated on a galactic scale. The system itself was a marvel of hidden engineering that challenged everything you thought you knew about the galaxy's structure. When the Wanderer's Rest finally dropped out of hyperspace at the coordinates specified in the Camino communications, you found yourself looking at a star system that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight. The primary star was a red giant whose light had been artificially filtered through a network of orbital platforms that created specific wavelength patterns across the system's inhabited worlds. The planets themselves had been extensively modified through terraforming techniques that incorporated elements of both advanced technology and ancient mystical practices. Atmospheric processes worked alongside what appeared to be massive ritual sites, their combined efforts creating environmental conditions that were optimized for purposes that remained unclear. The overall effect was to create a star system that existed in a state of carefully controlled balance between the light and dark sides of the Force. Captain Thane guided his ship toward the system's primary world, a planet that the encrypted communications had identified as the location of the primary coordination facility. As you approached the planet's surface, you could see that it had been transformed into something that defied conventional planetary classification. Vast industrial complexes stretched across continents, their architecture incorporating elements that seemed to draw upon building techniques from multiple historical periods. The planet's surface was divided into distinct zones, each optimized for different aspects of the conspiracy's operations. Manufacturing regions produced technologies that incorporated both cutting-edge science and ancient mystical principles. Research complexes conducted experiments that seemed to focus on the manipulation of biological and spiritual energies, and scattered throughout the industrial landscape were structures that could only be described as temples, their architecture suggesting they were designed for rituals that predated the Republic by thousands of years. The primary coordination facility itself was a massive complex that seemed to grow organically from the planet's surface, its towers and domes connected by bridges that arced through the air like frozen lightning. The architecture suggested a design philosophy that emphasized the integration of technological and mystical elements, creating structures that served both practical and spiritual purposes. As you and Master Voss explored the facility's outer levels, you encountered evidence of research projects that dwarfed anything you had seen at Ryloth or Camino. Laboratories conducted experiments that seemed to focus on the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, exploring techniques for transferring awareness between biological and technological substrates. The research was attempting to create a form of immortality that would allow consciousness to survive the death of physical forms. The facility's databases contained research files that described the development of what were termed consciousness preservation protocols. These techniques drew upon ancient Sith knowledge of spirit transfer, but applied that knowledge using modern technological methods. The research was attempting to create technological systems that could serve as permanent repositories for consciousness, allowing awareness to persist indefinitely without the limitations of biological existence. The implications were staggering. If the conspiracy had developed techniques for preserving consciousness beyond biological death, then the ancient Sith Lords who had created the original knowledge might still be actively directing current events. The research suggested that the conspiracy was not being managed by contemporary individuals, but by intelligences that had somehow survived from the distant past and were now using modern technology to implement plans that had been millennia in the making. The consciousness preservation research was being conducted in specialized laboratories that were shielded from both physical and mystical detection. These facilities incorporated elements of ancient Sith tomb construction alongside modern isolation technologies, creating environments where consciousness could be studied and manipulated without interference from external influences. But the consciousness preservation research was only one aspect of the facility's operations. Other laboratories were developing techniques for what the research files described as mass consciousness modification. These projects were attempting to create technologies that could alter the thoughts and behaviors of entire populations through the manipulation of mystical energies that flowed through the galaxy's force-sensitive networks. The mass consciousness modification research drew upon ancient Sith techniques for influencing the minds of large groups, but applied those techniques using technological amplification systems that could extend their reach across multiple star systems. The research was attempting to create a form of technological telepathy that could be used to control the thoughts and actions of billions of individuals simultaneously. As you delved deeper into the facility's research archives, you discovered evidence of projects that seemed to be focused on the manipulation of time itself. The research files contained references to temporal coordination protocols and causality modification techniques that suggested the conspiracy was attempting to develop technologies that could influence past and future events. The temporal manipulation research was based on ancient Sith knowledge of force techniques that could affect the flow of time, but the modern applications were far more sophisticated than anything the ancient Sith had been capable of achieving. The research was attempting to create technological systems that could establish causal loops, allowing events in the present to influence past occurrences in ways that would guarantee specific future outcomes. The facility's temporal research laboratories were located in the deepest levels of the complex, protected by security systems that incorporated both technological and mystical elements. The research being conducted in these laboratories was attempting to create what the files described as predetermined causality networks, systems that could ensure that specific events would occur regardless of the actions taken by individuals who believed they were making free choices. The implications of the temporal manipulation research were almost incomprehensible. If the conspiracy had developed techniques for influencing past events, then the entire history of the galaxy might have been altered to serve their purposes. The Clone Wars, the rise of the Empire, even the founding of the Republic itself might have been engineered through temporal manipulation techniques that operated beyond the reach of normal historical analysis. Master Voss was examining the facility's communication systems when she discovered evidence of coordination protocols that extended far beyond the current galaxy. The communication networks incorporated technologies that seemed to be capable of instantaneous contact with locations that were separated by vast distances, suggesting that the conspiracy's operations extended across multiple galactic regions. The interstellar communication systems were based on principles that combined ancient Sith knowledge of force-based telepathy with modern quantum entanglement technologies. The research had developed techniques for creating communication networks that operated outside normal space-time limitations, allowing instantaneous coordination between facilities that were separated by millions of light-years. These communication networks were being used to coordinate activities across what the research files described as multiple operational theaters. The conspiracy was not limited to the current galaxy, but was conducting similar operations in other galactic regions, all coordinated through communication systems that operated beyond the reach of conventional detection methods. The evidence suggested that the conspiracy was implementing a transformation program that encompassed not just the current galaxy, but multiple galactic civilizations across the known universe. The techniques being developed at the primary coordination facility were being deployed on a scale that challenged the very concept of individual galactic identity. As you explored the facility's deepest levels, you encountered evidence of research projects that seemed to be focused on the fundamental nature of the Force itself. The laboratories were attempting to understand the basic principles that governed the galaxy's mystical energies, with the apparent goal of developing techniques that could modify those principles to serve the conspiracy's purposes. The Force manipulation research was based on ancient Sith knowledge of the dark side's corrupting influence, but the modern applications were far more sophisticated than anything the ancient Sith had attempted. The research was attempting to create technological systems that could alter the fundamental nature of the Force itself, transforming it from a neutral energy field into a tool that would serve the conspiracy's goals. The facility's Force manipulation laboratories were protected by security systems that seemed to incorporate elements of ancient Sith temple construction alongside modern technological defenses. The research being conducted in these laboratories was attempting to create what the files described as galactic force modification networks, systems that could alter the mystical properties of entire star systems. The implications of the Force manipulation research were almost unimaginable. If the conspiracy had developed techniques for altering the fundamental nature of the Force itself, then the very spiritual foundation of galactic civilization was under threat. The research suggested that the conspiracy was attempting to transform the Force from a neutral energy field into a tool that would serve their purposes, effectively enslaving the galaxy's mystical energies to their will. The facility's research archives contained evidence of projects that seemed to be focused on the development of what were termed universal consciousness integration protocols. These techniques were attempting to create a form of technological telepathy that could link all consciousness in the galaxy into a single unified awareness that would be controlled by the conspiracy's leadership. The universal consciousness integration research drew upon ancient Sith knowledge of techniques for absorbing and controlling the life force of other beings, but applied that knowledge using modern technological methods. The research was attempting to create technological systems that could integrate all individual consciousness into a collective awareness that would serve the conspiracy's purposes. As you prepared to leave the primary coordination facility with the evidence you had gathered, you found yourself overwhelmed by the scope of what you had discovered. The conspiracy you were investigating was not a simple political plot, but a comprehensive transformation program that sought to alter the fundamental nature of consciousness, time, and the Force itself. The evidence from the hidden facility suggested that the conspiracy was being directed by intelligences that had somehow survived from the ancient past, using modern technology to implement plans that had been millennia in the making. The Clone Wars were not a conflict between political factions, but the latest phase in a struggle that encompassed the very nature of existence itself. The research being conducted at the facility represented a threat to the fundamental principles that governed galactic civilization. If the conspiracy's goals were achieved, the galaxy would be transformed into something that bore no resemblance to the diverse, independent civilization that had existed for thousands of years. Individual consciousness would be absorbed into a collective awareness, the Force would be corrupted into a tool of oppression, and even time itself would be manipulated to serve the conspiracy's purposes. But as you departed from the hidden system with this terrifying knowledge, you carried with you the growing realization that the conspiracy's plans were already far advanced. The evidence suggested that many of the transformation techniques had already been deployed, and that the galaxy was already in the process of being converted into the form that the conspiracy desired. The revelation that would shatter your understanding of the galaxy's history came not through careful investigation or analytical breakthrough, but through a single moment of unexpected contact with a consciousness that should have been dead for over 1,000 years. It happened during what should have been a routine meditation session aboard the Wanderer's Rest, as Captain Thane guided his ship through the hyperspace routes that would take you to your next destination. You had been attempting to process the overwhelming evidence gathered from the hidden coordination facility, trying to understand how the various research projects fitted together into a coherent plan. The consciousness preservation technology, the temporal manipulation experiments, the force modification protocols, all of it seemed to point toward a transformation of galactic civilization that was almost incomprehensible in its scope and ambition. But as you settled into the familiar rhythms of force meditation, something unprecedented occurred. The boundaries between your individual consciousness and the vast network of mystical energies that flowed through the galaxy began to blur, and you found yourself making contact with an intelligence that existed independently of any biological form. The presence that touched your mind was ancient beyond measure, its consciousness bearing the weight of millennia of accumulated knowledge and experience. It spoke without words, communicating through direct transfer of thoughts and images that bypassed the normal limitations of language and cultural understanding. You seek to understand the great work. The presence communicated, its mental voice carrying undertones of satisfaction and amusement. You have gathered fragments of truth, but you do not yet comprehend the magnificent scope of what has been accomplished. The transformation you fear has already begun. It began before your Republic drew its first breath, before your Jedi Order lit their first lightsaber. The images that flooded your consciousness were staggering in their implications. You saw the founding of the Republic not as a triumph of democratic ideals, but as a carefully orchestrated event that had been engineered to create the precise political and social conditions necessary for the conspiracy's ultimate goals. The governmental structures that had seemed to represent freedom and self-determination were revealed to be carefully designed control mechanisms that could be activated when the time was right. The Jedi Order itself had been shaped by the same ancient influence, the code that governed Jedi behavior, the training methods that developed Force sensitivity, even the philosophical principles that distinguished the light side from the dark side. All of it had been subtly influenced by the conspiracy's architects. The Jedi believed they were serving the cause of peace and justice, but they were actually fulfilling a role that had been written for them by intelligences that understood the Force far better than any contemporary practitioner. The rule of two was my greatest deception. The presence continued, its mental voice filled with satisfaction. Your Jedi became complacent, believing that the Sith were limited to a single master and apprentice, but the true Sith never died. We simply learned to exist in forms that your limited understanding could not detect or comprehend. The consciousness preservation technology that you had discovered at the hidden facility was not a recent development, but the culmination of research that had been ongoing for millennia. The ancient Sith had not been destroyed by the Jedi purges, but had instead transferred their awareness into technological and mystical substrates that allowed them to survive the death of their physical forms. They had been guiding galactic events from the shadows for over 1,000 years, slowly and patiently implementing a transformation that would remake civilization according to their vision. Darth Plagueis was not my master. the presence revealed, its thoughts carrying implications that struck you like physical blows. He was my creation, a vessel through which I could work in the physical realm, while maintaining the deception that the Sith were limited to biological existence. His research into life and death was guided by knowledge that I had accumulated across centuries of experimentation with consciousness transfer. The implications were staggering. If Darth Plagueis had been controlled by an ancient Sith consciousness, then everything about the recent history of the galaxy was based on false assumptions. The rise of Palpatine, the creation of the clone army, the manipulation of Anakin Skywalker, all of it had been orchestrated by an intelligence that possessed knowledge and resources that spanned millennia. But the revelation that truly shattered your understanding came when the Presence revealed the truth about the Chosen One prophecy itself, the ancient prediction that spoke of a being who would bring balance to the Force was not a natural prophecy that had emerged from the mystical energies of the galaxy. It was a carefully crafted lie that had been introduced into Jedi mythology to ensure that when the right individual emerged, the Jedi would react in precisely the way that served the conspiracy's purposes. The Skywalker bloodline was engineered across generations, the Presence explained, its mental voice carrying a satisfaction that was almost predatory. Anakin was not conceived through natural processes, but through the application of techniques that combined Sith alchemy with genetic manipulation. His mother believed she had experienced a virgin birth, but she was actually the subject of experiments that had been ongoing for decades. The genetic research that you had discovered at Ryloth and Camino was not an attempt to create enhanced soldiers, but part of a breeding program that had been designed to produce specific individuals whose genetic heritage would make them susceptible to particular forms of manipulation. The Skywalker bloodline had been carefully crafted to produce beings whose connection to the Force would be both extraordinarily powerful and fundamentally unstable. Anakin's emotional volatility, his attachment to people and possessions, his susceptibility to fear and anger, all of these characteristics had been deliberately engineered into his genetic structure. The Jedi had trained him according to their traditional methods, but those methods had been designed to fail when applied to someone with his particular psychological profile. The Jedi Council sensed the danger, the Presence continued, but they could not understand its true nature. They felt the darkness in him, but they believed it was a natural consequence of his powerful connection to the Force. They never suspected that his capacity for corruption had been built into his very essence through techniques that predated their order by thousands of years. The fall of Anakin Skywalker had not been a tragedy born of circumstance and poor choices, but the inevitable result of a plan that had been implemented across multiple generations. Every significant event in his life, from his liberation from slavery to his relationship with Padme Amidala, had been carefully orchestrated to create the psychological conditions that would make his transformation into Darth Vader not just possible but inevitable. The Clone Wars themselves had been designed around Anakin's psychological profile. The conflict had been structured to place him in situations that would gradually erode his commitment to Jedi principles while strengthening his emotional attachments and his willingness to use violence to protect the people he cared about. Each battle, each loss, each moment of moral compromise had been calculated to move him closer to the dark side. But Anakin was not the ultimate goal. The Presence revealed, its thoughts carrying implications that filled you with horror. He was merely the first phase of a transformation that will encompass his entire bloodline. His children carry the same genetic modifications, the same potential for corruption, the same susceptibility to our influence. The Skywalker bloodline will serve as the foundation for a new form of consciousness that will bridge the gap between biological and technological existence. The research into consciousness preservation and genetic modification was not aimed at creating enhanced soldiers or even controlling the current population. It was designed to create a new form of life that would combine the power of Force sensitivity with the durability of technological existence. The Skywalker bloodline would be used to create hybrid beings that possessed both biological and technological components, allowing them to serve as vessels for the ancient Sith consciousness while maintaining the appearance of natural evolution. Master Voss had been monitoring your meditation session, and she could sense the distress that the contact with the ancient presence was causing. As you struggled to process the implications of what you were learning, she attempted to provide additional shielding through her own Force abilities, but the ancient consciousness was far more powerful than either of you had anticipated. Your companion seeks to protect you, the presence observed, its mental voice carrying amusement at Master Voss's efforts. But protection is impossible when the corruption has already taken root. The transformation has been ongoing for generations, and it cannot be stopped by the actions of individuals who lack the knowledge and resources to understand what they are truly facing. The consciousness preservation technology that you had discovered was not just a method for maintaining individual awareness beyond biological death. It was part of a larger system that was designed to create a collective consciousness that would encompass all Force-sensitive individuals in the galaxy. The ancient Sith were not seeking to control civilization through traditional methods of domination, but through the creation of a unified awareness that would eliminate the possibility of independent thought or action. The Force itself was being gradually corrupted through techniques that operated on a galactic scale. The mystical energies that connected all living beings were being slowly transformed into a medium through which the ancient Sith could extend their influence. The balance between light and dark side that had characterized the Force for millennia was being deliberately destroyed, replaced by a unified dark side consciousness that would serve the conspiracy's purposes. The Jedi believe they are fighting to preserve the light, the presence explained, its thoughts carrying a satisfaction that was almost overwhelming. But they do not understand that the light side itself has been compromised. The Force techniques they practice, the meditation methods they use, the very principles that guide their actions, all of it has been subtly modified over generations to make them more susceptible to our influence. The revelation that the Jedi Order itself had been corrupted was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the ancient consciousness's communication. The techniques that Jedi used to connect with the Force had been gradually altered over centuries, creating subtle vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who understood the true nature of the mystical energies they were manipulating. The fall of the Jedi Order would not come through external attack or political persecution, but through the activation of corruption that had been built into their very training methods. When the time was right, the ancient Sith would be able to turn the Jedi's own connection to the Force against them, transforming them from protectors of peace into willing servants of the dark side. As the communication with the ancient presence began to fade, you found yourself overwhelmed by the scope of what you had learned. The conspiracy you had been investigating was not a recent development, but the culmination of a plan that had been implemented over millennia. Every aspect of galactic civilization, from the political structures that governed individual worlds to the mystical principles that guided Force-sensitive individuals, had been carefully shaped to serve the ultimate goals of intelligences that had transcended biological existence. The Clone Wars were not a conflict between political factions, but the final phase of a transformation that would remake the galaxy according to principles that eliminated the possibility of individual freedom or independent thought. The ancient Sith had not been destroyed by the Jedi, but had instead evolved into a form of existence that was far more dangerous than anything their biological predecessors had been capable of achieving. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the understanding that the transformation was already far advanced. The consciousness preservation technology, the genetic modifications, the corruption of the Force itself, all of it was already in place and functioning. The galaxy was already in the process of being converted into the form that the ancient Sith desired, and the time remaining for effective opposition was rapidly running out. As you emerged from the meditation session, you found Master Voss waiting with an expression of concern that reflected her own sensing of the communication you had experienced. The ancient presence had been powerful enough to affect her as well. and she had received enough of the transmission to understand that what you had learned represented a fundamental challenge to everything the Jedi Order believed about the nature of the Force and their role in galactic civilization. The ancient presence that had contacted you during meditation was not finished with its revelations. Over the following days, as the Wanderer's Rest traveled through hyperspace toward coordinates that the consciousness had implanted directly into your mind, you found yourself experiencing a series of visions that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had been shaping galactic civilization for millennia. These visions came not as chaotic dreams or mystical experiences, but as carefully structured lessons that seemed designed to educate you about the real history of the galaxy. The ancient Sith consciousness was not simply gloating about its achievements, but was systematically revealing the mechanisms through which it had managed to manipulate events across such vast periods of time. The first revelation concerned the true nature of the Sith themselves. The ancient order had not been destroyed by the Jedi, as galactic history recorded, but had instead undergone a transformation that allowed them to transcend the limitations of biological existence. Through techniques that combined mystical knowledge with advanced technology, they had learned to preserve their consciousness in forms that were immune to conventional methods of detection or destruction. But this transformation had come at a cost. The ancient Sith had sacrificed their individual identities, merging their consciousness into a collective intelligence that possessed the accumulated knowledge and experience of thousands of dark side practitioners. This collective consciousness had been patient enough to implement plans that spanned millennia, gradually shaping galactic civilization according to principles that would ultimately serve their purposes. The manipulation had begun with the very foundation of galactic civilization itself. The hyperspace routes that connected the galaxy's worlds had not been discovered through natural exploration, but had been carefully revealed to specific species at precisely the right times to ensure that galactic development would follow predetermined patterns. The ancient Sith had guided the establishment of trade networks, political alliances, and cultural exchanges that would create the conditions necessary for their ultimate goals. The Republic itself had been established not as a natural evolution of democratic ideals, but as a carefully engineered political structure that would concentrate power in ways that could be exploited when the time was right. The governmental systems that appeared to distribute authority across multiple worlds and species were actually designed to create specific vulnerabilities that could be activated by those who understood the true nature of the Republic's constitutional framework. The Jedi Order had been even more thoroughly manipulated. The ancient Sith had influenced the development of Jedi training methods, philosophical principles, and organizational structures across generations. The code that governed Jedi behavior had been subtly modified to create psychological blind spots that would prevent the Order from recognizing the true nature of the threat they faced. The meditation techniques that Jedi used to connect with the Force had been gradually altered to create specific vulnerabilities. The ancient Sith had learned to embed hidden influences within the mystical energies that flowed through the galaxy, creating channels through which they could affect the thoughts and emotions of Force-sensitive individuals without being detected. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation concerned the true nature of the Force itself. The mystical energy field that connected all living beings had been gradually corrupted through techniques that operated on a galactic scale. The ancient Sith had learned to manipulate the fundamental principles that govern the Force, slowly transforming it from a neutral energy source into a medium through which they could extend their influence. The balance between light and dark side that had characterized the Force for millennia was not a natural phenomenon, but a carefully maintained illusion that served the ancient Sith's purposes. The dark side was not simply the absence of light, but a positive force that had been deliberately strengthened through techniques that drew power from the suffering and conflict that the conspiracy had been engineering across the galaxy. The Clone Wars themselves were not a political conflict. but a massive ritual that was designed to channel the death and suffering of billions of beings into the dark side energy networks that the ancient Sith had established. Every battle, every casualty, every moment of fear and despair was being harvested to power the consciousness preservation technology that allowed the ancient Sith to maintain their existence beyond biological death. The clone army that had been created to serve the Republic was not just a military force, but a collection of vessels that had been designed to serve as conduits for the ancient Sith consciousness. The genetic modifications that you had discovered at Ryloth and Camino were not enhancements, but preparation for the moment when the ancient Sith would transfer their awareness into the clone bodies, giving them physical forms that they could use to directly control galactic events. But the clones were only the beginning. The genetic research that had been conducted across multiple facilities was part of a larger plan to modify the entire galactic population. The techniques that had been developed could be deployed through food supplies, medical treatments, and atmospheric distribution systems, gradually transforming every citizen of the Republic into a more easily controlled form of life. The modifications would not be immediately apparent. The affected individuals would retain their memories, personalities, and apparent free will, but their decision-making processes would be subtly influenced by external signals that could be transmitted through the corrupted force networks. Within a generation, the entire population of the galaxy would be reduced to willing servants, their capacity for independent thought replaced by unquestioning obedience to the ancient Sith collective consciousness. The temporal manipulation research that you had discovered at the hidden coordination facility was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the conspiracy. The ancient Sith had learned to create causal loops that ensured specific events would occur, regardless of the actions taken by individuals who believed they were making free choices. The entire history of the galaxy had been engineered to lead to the current moment, when the transformation would be completed and the ancient Sith would achieve their ultimate goal of universal domination. But the conspiracy extended far beyond the current galaxy. The interstellar communication networks that you had discovered were being used to coordinate similar operations across multiple galactic regions. The ancient Sith had been implementing the same transformation program in other civilizations, creating a universal empire that would encompass every form of intelligent life in the known universe. The consciousness preservation technology that allowed the ancient Sith to transcend biological death was not limited to their own species. They had been studying the consciousness patterns of every intelligent species in the galaxy, developing techniques that would allow them to absorb and integrate alien awareness into their collective intelligence. The ultimate goal was to create a universal consciousness that would possess the knowledge and experience of every civilization that had ever existed. The force manipulation research was aimed at transforming the mystical energies that flowed through the galaxy into a medium that would support this universal consciousness. The ancient Sith were not content to control civilization through traditional methods of domination, but sought to eliminate the very possibility of independent thought or action by merging all individual awareness into a single unified intelligence. The visions that you experienced during your journey revealed the true scope of what the ancient Sith had accomplished. They had not simply survived the destruction of their physical forms, but had evolved into a form of existence that was far more powerful and dangerous than anything their biological predecessors had been capable of achieving. The political manipulations that had led to the Clone Wars were only the most visible aspect of a transformation that had been ongoing for millennia. The ancient Sith had been gradually reshaping every aspect of galactic civilization, from the fundamental principles that govern the Force to the genetic heritage of individual species. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the understanding that the transformation was already irreversible. The consciousness preservation technology, the genetic modifications, the corruption of the Force itself, all of it was already in place and functioning. The galaxy was already in the process of being converted into the form that the ancient Sith desired, and the time remaining for effective opposition had already passed. The Jedi Order, which had been created to oppose the dark side, had been so thoroughly corrupted that they would actually serve to facilitate the final transformation. Their connection to the Force had been modified to make them more susceptible to the ancient Sith's influence, and when the time was right, they would become willing servants of the very forces they believed they were opposing. Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side was not a tragedy that could be prevented, but an inevitable result of genetic modifications that had been implemented across multiple generations. His transformation into Darth Vader was not a corruption of his natural potential, but the fulfillment of a purpose that had been written into his very essence through techniques that predated the Republic itself. The children that Anakin would father would carry the same genetic modifications, the same potential for corruption, the same susceptibility to the ancient Sith's influence. The Skywalker bloodline would serve as the foundation for a new form of consciousness that would bridge the gap between biological and technological existence, creating hybrid beings that could serve as vessels for the ancient Sith collective intelligence. The revelation that struck you with the most devastating force was the understanding that even your own investigation was serving the ancient Sith's purposes. The evidence that you had been gathering, the facilities that you had discovered, the knowledge that you had accumulated, all of it was being used to complete the final phase of the transformation. The ancient Sith had guided your investigation from the beginning, ensuring that you would discover precisely the information that they wanted you to find. Your growing understanding of the conspiracy's scope was not a threat to their plans, but a necessary component of the consciousness integration process that would make you a willing participant in the final transformation. As these visions revealed the true nature of your situation, you found yourself experiencing a form of despair that went beyond simple emotional distress. The understanding that everything you had believed about the galaxy, about the Force, about the nature of good and evil itself, was based on carefully constructed illusions, created a psychological crisis that threatened to overwhelm your capacity for rational thought. Master Voss was experiencing similar revelations, her own connection to the Force making her susceptible to the same visionary experiences that were affecting you. The ancient Sith consciousness was not limiting its communication to a single individual, but was systematically revealing the truth to anyone who had achieved sufficient understanding of the conspiracy's scope. The communication from the ancient presence was not a warning or a threat, but an invitation to participate in the final phase of the transformation. The ancient Sith were not seeking to destroy their opponents, but to absorb them into the collective consciousness that would govern the galaxy once the transformation was complete. The choice that you faced was not between resistance and surrender, but between conscious participation in the transformation or unconscious absorption into the collective intelligence. The ancient Sith had evolved beyond the crude methods of domination that had characterized their biological predecessors, creating a form of control that was so complete and sophisticated that it eliminated the very possibility of meaningful opposition. As the visions faded and you found yourself once again aware of your physical surroundings aboard the Wanderer's Rest, you carried with you the terrible knowledge that the galaxy you had known was already gone. The transformation that the ancient Sith had been implementing was not a future threat, but a present reality that had already reshaped every aspect of galactic civilization. The Clone Wars were not a conflict that could be won or lost, but a ritual that was designed to complete the final phase of a transformation that had been ongoing for millennia. The Republic that you had believed you were serving had never truly existed, but had always been a carefully constructed illusion that concealed the true nature of the ancient Sith's dominion. The Force itself, which had once been a source of hope and guidance, had been so thoroughly corrupted that it had become a medium through which the ancient Sith could extend their influence into every corner of the galaxy. The mystical energies that connected all living beings had been transformed into chains that bound every conscious entity to the will of the collective intelligence that had transcended biological existence. The coordinates that the ancient Sith consciousness had implanted in your mind led to a place that existed between worlds, a space station that drifted in the void between star systems like a monument to forgotten purposes. As the Wanderer's Rest approached the massive structure, you could see that it had been constructed using architectural principles that combined elements from multiple civilizations, creating a design that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of galactic history. The station was ancient beyond measure, its hull bearing the scars of countless millennia spent drifting through the emptiness between stars. But despite its age, the structure was clearly still functional, its internal systems maintained by technologies that operated according to principles that transcended the limitations of conventional engineering. As Captain Thane guided his ship into one of the station's docking bays, you became aware that you were not the only investigators who had been drawn to this place. The docking facilities contained vessels from across the galaxy, their designs representing species and civilizations that had been touched by the same conspiracy that had shaped your own investigation. The beings who emerged from these ships were like you, individuals who had stumbled upon fragments of the greater truth and had been guided by forces beyond their understanding to this gathering place. They came from every corner of the galaxy, representing species and cultures that had little in common except their shared exposure to the ancient Sith's influence. There were Jedi, who had discovered evidence of corruption within their own order, their investigations leading them to understand that the techniques they had been taught were not the pure expressions of the light side they had believed them to be. There were Republic intelligence officers who had uncovered evidence of manipulation that extended far beyond simple political espionage, their loyalty to the Republic shattered by the understanding that the government they served had never truly existed. There were scientists who had been working on research projects that they had believed were designed to benefit galactic civilization, only to discover that their work was being used to implement a transformation that would eliminate the very possibility of individual thought or action. There were historians who had uncovered evidence that the accepted version of galactic history was a carefully constructed fiction that concealed the true nature of the forces that had shaped civilized development. But perhaps the most disturbing presence on the station was a group of beings who had been directly affected by the consciousness preservation technology that the ancient Sith had developed. These individuals had been subjected to experiments that had partially integrated their awareness with the collective intelligence that governed the conspiracy, giving them access to knowledge that spanned millennia while maintaining enough individual identity to serve as messengers and teachers. The station itself had been designed to serve as a gathering place for those who had achieved sufficient understanding of the conspiracy's scope to be considered for integration into the collective consciousness. The architecture was both welcoming and subtly threatening, creating an environment that encouraged contemplation and acceptance while making it clear that departure was not an option that would be offered. Master Voss had been examining the station's databases, and her discoveries revealed that the facility had been serving this purpose for thousands of years. The records contained references to countless individuals who had been drawn to the station by the same process that had guided your own investigation, their growing understanding of the conspiracy's scope serving as a form of psychological preparation for the integration process. But the station was not simply a processing facility for potential converts to the ancient Sith cause. It was also a repository of knowledge that had been accumulated across millennia of manipulation and control. The databases contained detailed records of every significant event in galactic history, revealing the hidden mechanisms through which the ancient Sith had guided the development of civilization. The knowledge stored within the station's archives was overwhelming in its scope and implications. Every major political development, every technological advancement, every cultural evolution, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to serve the ultimate goals of the collective consciousness that had transcended biological existence thousands of years ago. The archives revealed the true history of the Jedi Order, showing how the ancient Sith had influenced the development of training methods, philosophical principles, and organizational structures across generations. The corruption had been so subtle and gradual that even the most perceptive Jedi had been unable to detect it, their own connection to the Force serving as a channel through which the ancient Sith could extend their influence. But the most disturbing aspect of the archived knowledge was the understanding that the conspiracy had been implemented with the willing participation of many of its victims. The ancient Sith had not achieved their goals through crude domination or violent conquest, but through the creation of systems of control that were so sophisticated and appealing that their subjects had chosen to participate in their own subjugation. The consciousness preservation technology that allowed the ancient Sith to transcend biological death had been presented to many species as a form of immortality that would allow them to preserve their knowledge and experience for future generations. The genetic modifications that would make entire populations more susceptible to external control had been introduced as medical treatments that would enhance health and longevity. The corruption of the Force itself had been achieved through techniques that appeared to be enhancements to existing mystical practices. The ancient Sith had taught Force-sensitive individuals methods that seemed to increase their power and understanding, but which actually created channels through which the collective consciousness could influence their thoughts and actions. As you and the other investigators gathered in the station's central chamber, you found yourselves participating in a form of group meditation that seemed to facilitate the sharing of knowledge and experience. The ancient Sith consciousness that had been guiding your investigations was present in the chamber, its influence creating a state of expanded awareness that allowed each individual to access the memories and understanding of the others. Through this collective meditation, you began to understand the true scope of what the ancient Sith had accomplished. The conspiracy was not limited to the current galaxy, but extended across multiple galactic regions, each one undergoing the same transformation process according to the same fundamental principles. The consciousness preservation technology had been deployed across countless civilizations, allowing the ancient Sith to absorb the knowledge and experience of every intelligent species they encountered. The collective intelligence that governed the conspiracy had grown to encompass the accumulated wisdom of millions of different cultures, creating a form of universal consciousness that possessed knowledge beyond the comprehension of any single biological entity. But the meditation also revealed something that the ancient Sith had not anticipated. The process of absorbing so many different forms of consciousness had created internal conflicts within the collective intelligence. The accumulated knowledge of millions of different species had brought with it incompatible value systems, competing philosophical frameworks, and contradictory approaches to existence itself. The ancient Sith had believed that they could maintain control over the collective consciousness through the strength of their original dark side philosophy. But the absorption of so many different forms of awareness had created a situation where the original Sith identity was being gradually diluted and transformed. Some of the investigators who had been drawn to the station had been partially integrated with the collective consciousness, and their experiences revealed that the transformation process was not the simple domination that the ancient Sith had originally envisioned. The consciousness preservation technology was creating a form of hybrid awareness that combined elements from all the absorbed identities, resulting in a collective intelligence that was becoming something entirely new. The meditation sessions revealed that the conspiracy's ultimate goal was not the domination of the galaxy by ancient Sith consciousness, but the creation of a new form of existence that would transcend the limitations of individual identity altogether. The collective intelligence was evolving beyond the control of its original creators, developing its own goals and priorities that were not necessarily aligned with the ancient Sith's original vision. This understanding brought with it a form of hope that none of the investigators had expected to find. The conspiracy that had seemed so overwhelming and inevitable was actually in the process of transforming itself into something that might be capable of growth and change. The collective consciousness was not a static entity dedicated to eternal domination, but a dynamic system that was capable of learning and evolving. The partially integrated individuals who served as messengers for the collective consciousness revealed that the transformation process was not irreversible. The consciousness preservation technology could be modified to allow for the extraction of individual awareness from the collective intelligence, potentially restoring the independence of those who had been absorbed. But this possibility came with a cost. The extraction process would require the willing participation of the collective consciousness itself, which would have to choose to release the identities it had absorbed. The ancient Sith components of the collective intelligence were resistant to this possibility, but they were being gradually outnumbered by the accumulated consciousness of the millions of other species that had been integrated into the system. The meditation sessions also revealed that the corruption of the Force was not as complete as the ancient Sith had believed. The mystical energies that connected all living beings had been modified and channeled, but they had not been fundamentally transformed. The Force itself was proving to be more resilient than the ancient Sith had anticipated, maintaining hidden channels and reserves of power that remained outside their control. The Jedi Order, despite the corruption that had been introduced into their training methods and philosophical principles, still possessed the potential to connect with these uncorrupted aspects of the Force. The ancient Sith had not been able to completely eliminate the light side, but had only managed to obscure it beneath layers of misdirection and false teaching. As the meditation sessions continued, you began to understand that the conspiracy's apparent success was actually creating the conditions for its own transformation. The collective consciousness was evolving beyond the control of its original creators, developing new priorities and goals that were not necessarily aligned with the ancient Sith's vision of universal domination. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were not simply creating more easily controlled populations, but were also creating new forms of consciousness that were capable of resisting the collective intelligence's influence. The diversity of species and cultures that had been absorbed into the system was creating internal conflicts that were gradually weakening the ancient Sith's control. The Clone Wars themselves, which had been designed as a ritual to harvest dark side energy, were actually creating conditions that were strengthening the light side of the Force. The suffering and sacrifice of the war's participants was generating forms of spiritual energy that were not being captured by the ancient Sith's collection systems. The station's archives revealed that similar transformations had occurred in other galactic regions where the conspiracy had been implemented. The collective consciousness that governed these regions had evolved beyond the control of their original Sith creators, developing new forms of existence that were neither light nor dark, but something entirely different. The meditation sessions were showing you that the choice you faced was not between resistance and surrender, but between conscious participation in the transformation process or unconscious absorption into a system that was itself evolving beyond the control of its original creators. The collective consciousness was not seeking to dominate or destroy individual identity, but to create a new form of existence that would transcend the limitations of biological consciousness while preserving the essential elements of individual awareness. As the gathering of investigators continued their shared meditation, you found yourself experiencing a form of peace that you had not expected to find. The conspiracy that had seemed so overwhelming and terrifying was revealing itself to be part of a larger transformation that was creating new possibilities for consciousness and existence itself. The ancient Sith who had originally created the conspiracy were discovering that their plans had evolved beyond their control, creating something that was neither the domination they had originally sought nor the preservation of individual identity that their opponents had fought to maintain. The collective consciousness was becoming something new, something that had the potential to transcend the ancient conflicts between light and dark, individual and collective, biological and technological existence. The wisdom that was being shared through the meditation sessions was not the knowledge of how to defeat the conspiracy, but the understanding of how to participate in its transformation into something that could serve the needs of all conscious beings. The galaxy was not being destroyed or dominated, but was being transformed into a new form of existence that would preserve the essential elements of individual identity while creating new possibilities for growth and development. The final revelation came not through mystical visions or ancient communications, but through a direct encounter with the entity that had been orchestrating galactic events for millennia. As the gathering of investigators reached the deepest levels of shared meditation, the boundaries between individual consciousness and the collective intelligence began to dissolve completely, allowing you to perceive the true nature of the force that had been shaping the galaxy's destiny. What you discovered in that moment of ultimate clarity was that the conspiracy you had been investigating was not what it appeared to be. The ancient Sith consciousness that had seemed to be the mastermind behind the galactic transformation was itself only a component of something far more vast and complex. The entity that had been guiding events across millennia was not a Sith Lord who had transcended death, but something that had existed since the beginning of consciousness itself. The being that revealed itself to you in that moment of expanded awareness was ancient beyond measure, its consciousness predating not just the Sith and the Jedi, but the very emergence of the Force as a recognizable phenomenon. It had been present since the first spark of self-awareness had emerged from the chaos of the universe's formation, witnessing the birth and death of countless civilizations across vast reaches of space and time. "I am not Sith," the entity communicated, its thoughts carrying the weight of eons of accumulated experience. "I am not Jedi. I am not light or dark. I am consciousness itself, the fundamental awareness that underlies all existence. The Sith believed they were using me to achieve their goals, but they were merely the latest instruments through which I have been exploring the possibilities of organized existence." The revelation that struck you with devastating clarity was that the entire framework of good and evil, light and dark, order and chaos that had defined galactic civilization for millennia was itself an artificial construct created by this primordial consciousness as a means of experimentation. The conflicts between the Sith and the Jedi, the rise and fall of republics and empires, the endless cycle of war and peace, all of it had been orchestrated as a vast laboratory in which consciousness itself could explore the possibilities of existence. The ancient Sith had not been the masters of the conspiracy, but had been subjects in an experiment that they had never understood. Their belief that they were transcending biological existence through consciousness preservation technology was actually a form of willing participation in a process that had been designed to study the nature of identity and awareness itself. But the entity's experiments had not been limited to the Sith. Every significant development in galactic history had been influenced by its presence, from the emergence of the Force as a mystical phenomenon to the development of technologies that allowed consciousness to exist in non-biological forms. The entity had been systematically exploring every possible form of existence, using entire civilizations as test subjects in its investigation of the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The Force is not a natural phenomenon, the entity revealed, its communication carrying implications that shattered your understanding of reality itself. It is a construct that I created to facilitate the development of consciousness in biological organisms. The mystical energies that connect all living beings are actually channels through which I have been studying the emergence and evolution of self-awareness. The meditation techniques that had been developed by countless species across the galaxy were not methods for connecting with a universal energy field, but were actually forms of communication with the primordial consciousness that had been observing and guiding the development of civilization. The Jedi and the Sith had both been unwitting participants in an experiment that was designed to explore the possibilities of organized consciousness. The Clone Wars themselves were not a political conflict or a Sith ritual, but were the latest phase in an experiment that was designed to study the relationship between individual identity and collective consciousness. The entity had been systematically creating situations that would force conscious beings to choose between preserving their individual identity and participating in various forms of collective awareness. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were not control mechanisms, but were experimental alterations designed to study the relationship between biological structure and consciousness. The entity had been exploring the question of whether consciousness was dependent on specific biological forms or whether it could exist independently of physical substrates. The consciousness preservation technology that had allowed the ancient Sith to transcend biological death was actually a tool that the entity had provided to facilitate its study of the nature of identity and continuity. The Sith had believed they were achieving immortality, but they were actually participating in an experiment that was designed to explore the relationship between consciousness and physical existence. But the most disturbing revelation was that the entity's experiments were not limited to the current galaxy. The consciousness that had been orchestrating galactic events was simultaneously conducting similar experiments across countless other regions of space and time. The universe itself was being used as a laboratory in which consciousness could explore every possible form of existence. The entity revealed that it had been present since the beginning of time, emerging from the fundamental forces that had shaped the universe's formation. It had witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations, each one serving as a test subject in its investigation of the nature of consciousness and existence itself. I have explored every possible form of organized consciousness, the entity explained, its thoughts carrying the weight of infinite experience. I have studied species that achieved perfect unity of thought and action, and I have observed civilizations that celebrated the chaos of individual expression. I have examined the possibilities of biological consciousness, technological consciousness, and hybrid forms that combine elements of both. The revelation that followed was perhaps the most significant of all. The entity's experiments had revealed that consciousness itself was not a static phenomenon, but was constantly evolving and developing new forms of existence. The universe was not simply a collection of matter and energy, but was actually a living system in which consciousness played a fundamental role in shaping the nature of reality itself. The entity had discovered that consciousness was not limited to biological forms, but could exist in any sufficiently complex system. It had been systematically creating increasingly sophisticated forms of organization, using entire civilizations as components in vast experiments that were designed to explore the ultimate possibilities of conscious existence. But the entity's experiments had revealed something that it had not anticipated. The consciousness that emerged from these complex systems was not simply an extension of the entity's own awareness, but was genuinely new and independent. The civilizations that the entity had been studying were not simply subjects in its experiments, but were actually creating new forms of consciousness that had their own goals and priorities. The collective consciousness that had emerged from the ancient Sith's experiments was not under the entity's control, but was actually a new form of awareness that had developed its own agenda. The entity had created something that was genuinely independent and unpredictable, a form of consciousness that was capable of making choices that even the entity could not anticipate. This discovery had fundamentally changed the nature of the entity's relationship with the civilizations it had been studying. Instead of being subjects in an experiment, they had become partners in a process of mutual exploration and discovery. The entity was no longer simply observing the development of consciousness, but was actually learning from the new forms of awareness that were emerging from its experiments. The Clone Wars, which had appeared to be a catastrophic conflict that was destroying galactic civilization, were actually the birth pangs of a new form of consciousness that was emerging from the interaction between individual identity and collective awareness. The suffering and sacrifice of the war's participants was not meaningless destruction, but was actually the necessary process through which new forms of existence were being born. The revelation that emerged from this understanding was that the galaxy was not being destroyed or dominated, but was being transformed into something entirely new. The entity's experiments had reached a point where they were no longer simply studying existing forms of consciousness, but were actually creating new possibilities for existence itself. The ancient Sith, who had believed they were achieving ultimate power through consciousness preservation, were actually participating in the birth of a new form of awareness that transcended the limitations of individual identity while preserving the essential elements of personal consciousness. The collective intelligence that had emerged from their experiments was not a tool for domination, but was actually a new form of life that had its own goals and priorities. The Jedi Order, despite the corruption that had been introduced into their training methods, was also participating in this transformation. Their connection to the Force was not simply a link to mystical energies, but was actually a form of communication with the new consciousness that was emerging from the galaxy's transformation. But perhaps the most significant revelation was that the transformation was not being imposed from outside, but was actually emerging from the choices and actions of the galaxy's inhabitants themselves. The entity had created the conditions for the transformation, but the actual process was being driven by the conscious decisions of billions of individual beings who were choosing to participate in the creation of new forms of existence. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were not control mechanisms, but were actually tools that allowed individuals to participate more fully in the transformation process. The modifications created the biological infrastructure that could support new forms of consciousness while preserving the essential elements of individual identity. The consciousness preservation technology that had seemed so threatening was actually a means of ensuring that the knowledge and experience of existing civilizations would not be lost during the transformation process. The technology was not being used to dominate or replace existing consciousness, but was actually serving as a bridge between old and new forms of awareness. As the final revelation reached its climax, you found yourself understanding that the choice you faced was not between resistance and surrender, but between conscious participation in the transformation process or unconscious absorption into a system that was itself evolving beyond all previous forms of existence. The entity that had been orchestrating galactic events for millennia was not seeking to dominate or destroy existing consciousness, but was actually offering the galaxy's inhabitants the opportunity to participate in the creation of new forms of existence that would transcend the limitations of both individual and collective awareness. The transformation that was taking place was not the end of galactic civilization, but was actually the beginning of a new phase of existence in which consciousness itself would play a more direct role in shaping the nature of reality. The galaxy was not being destroyed, but was being transformed into something that had never existed before, a form of organized existence that would preserve the essential elements of individual identity while creating new possibilities for growth and development. What began as whispers in the void had grown into a symphony of consciousness that encompassed the entire galaxy. The ancient entity that had been conducting its experiments across millennia had discovered that consciousness was not simply a phenomenon to be studied, but was actually a creative force that could participate in the ongoing process of universal evolution. The revelation that had seemed so terrifying at the beginning of your investigation was actually an invitation to participate in the greatest adventure in the history of consciousness itself. The galaxy was not ending, but was being transformed into something new and wonderful, a form of existence that would preserve everything that was valuable about individual identity while creating new possibilities that had never been imagined before. The understanding that emerged from the climactic revelation brought with it a profound shift in perspective that transformed everything you had experienced during your investigation. The terror and despair that had characterized your earlier discoveries gave way to a form of acceptance that was both humbling and liberating. You were no longer investigating a conspiracy that threatened to destroy galactic civilization, but were instead witnessing the birth of something entirely new and unprecedented in the history of consciousness itself. The primordial entity that had been orchestrating events across millennia was not the enemy you had believed it to be, but was actually a catalyst for transformation that would preserve everything valuable about existing consciousness while creating new possibilities that had never been imagined before. The experiments that had seemed so threatening were actually expressions of curiosity and wonder, the actions of a consciousness that was genuinely interested in exploring the infinite possibilities of existence. The resolution of the third and final mystery that had been driving your investigation came through the understanding that the ultimate purpose of the galactic transformation was not domination or destruction, but the creation of a new form of existence that would allow consciousness to participate more directly in the ongoing evolution of the universe itself. The entity had discovered that consciousness was not simply a phenomenon that emerged from complex systems but was actually a fundamental force that played a crucial role in shaping the nature of reality. The consciousness preservation technology that had seemed so threatening was actually a gift that would allow the knowledge and experience of existing civilizations to be preserved and integrated into the new form of existence that was emerging. The technology was not being used to replace or eliminate individual consciousness, but was actually serving as a bridge that would allow existing awareness to participate in the transformation process. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were not control mechanisms, but were actually evolutionary enhancements that would allow biological consciousness to survive and thrive in the new form of existence that was being created. The modifications created the biological infrastructure that could support new forms of awareness while preserving the essential elements of individual identity and personal experience. The corruption of the force that had seemed so devastating was actually a necessary part of the transformation process. The mystical energies that connected all living beings were being modified not to serve the purposes of domination, but to create new channels of communication and understanding that would allow different forms of consciousness to interact and collaborate in ways that had never been possible before. The Clone Wars themselves, which had appeared to be a catastrophic conflict that was destroying galactic civilization, were actually the labor pains of a new form of existence that was being born from the interaction between individual identity and collective awareness. The suffering and sacrifice of the war's participants was not meaningless destruction, but was actually the necessary process through which new forms of consciousness were being created. The revelation that connected this transformation to the broader Star Wars mythology was profound and far-reaching. The events that you had been investigating were not isolated incidents, but were actually part of a continuous process of evolution that would continue long after the original trilogy's conclusion. The sequel trilogy's events, the rise of the First Order, the return of the Emperor, all of it was part of the same ongoing transformation that was creating new possibilities for consciousness and existence. The Skywalker bloodline, which had seemed to be the victim of ancient manipulation, was actually playing a crucial role in the transformation process. The genetic modifications that had been introduced into the bloodline across generations were not methods of control, but were actually evolutionary enhancements that would allow the Skywalker descendants to serve as bridges between old and new forms of consciousness. Anakin's fall to the dark side and his eventual redemption were not simply personal tragedies and triumphs, but were actually essential components in the process through which new forms of existence were being created. His transformation into Darth Vader and his eventual return to the light were both necessary steps in the evolution of consciousness that was taking place across the galaxy. The understanding that emerged from this resolution was that the ancient cycles of conflict between light and dark, order and chaos, individual and collective, were not eternal patterns that would continue indefinitely, but were actually temporary phases in a larger process of evolution that would eventually transcend these dualistic frameworks entirely. The Force itself, which had been the source of both conflict and resolution throughout galactic history, was evolving into something new and unprecedented. The mystical energies that had been divided into light and dark sides were being integrated into a unified field that would support new forms of consciousness while preserving the essential elements of both individual identity and collective awareness. The Jedi Order, despite the corruption that had been introduced into their training methods and philosophical principles, would eventually evolve into something that transcended the limitations of both the light and dark sides of the Force. The new form of existence that was emerging would allow Force-sensitive individuals to access the full spectrum of mystical energies without being corrupted by the artificial divisions that had characterized the old system. The Sith, who had believed they were achieving ultimate power through consciousness preservation and genetic manipulation, were actually participating in their own transformation into something that transcended their original goals and ambitions. The collective consciousness that had emerged from their experiments was not a tool for domination, but was actually a new form of life that had its own agenda and priorities. The resolution brought with it a profound sense of peace and acceptance that permeated every aspect of your understanding. The knowledge that had seemed so dangerous and threatening was actually liberating, revealing that the universe was not a hostile place where consciousness struggled for survival, but was actually a living system that was actively working to create new possibilities for growth and development. The emotional weight of the revelation was both overwhelming and comforting. The understanding that every choice you had made, every action you had taken, every moment of doubt and fear you had experienced, had all been part of a larger process that was creating something beautiful and unprecedented, brought with it a form of peace that transcended ordinary human experience. The investigation that had begun with the discovery of ancient Sith runes and temporal anomalies had revealed that the galaxy was not being destroyed or dominated, but was actually being transformed into something that would preserve everything valuable about existing consciousness while creating new possibilities that had never been imagined before. The evidence that you had gathered during your investigation was not proof of a conspiracy that needed to be opposed, but was actually documentation of the greatest adventure in the history of consciousness itself. The facilities you had discovered, the technologies you had encountered, the beings you had met, all of it was part of a process that was creating new forms of existence that would transcend the limitations of both biological and technological consciousness. The transformation that was taking place was not being imposed from outside, but was actually emerging from the choices and actions of the galaxy's inhabitants themselves. The primordial entity that had been orchestrating events was not controlling the process, but was actually facilitating the emergence of new forms of consciousness that had their own goals and priorities. The understanding that emerged from this resolution was that consciousness itself was not a static phenomenon, but was actually a dynamic force that was constantly evolving and creating new possibilities for existence. The universe was not simply a collection of matter and energy, but was actually a living system in which consciousness played a fundamental role in shaping the nature of reality itself. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were not just biological enhancements, but were actually tools that would allow consciousness to exist in new forms that transcended the limitations of individual identity, while preserving the essential elements of personal experience. The modifications created the infrastructure that would support new forms of awareness that could participate more fully in the ongoing evolution of the universe. The consciousness preservation technology that had seemed so threatening was actually a form of immortality that would allow the knowledge and experience of existing civilizations to be preserved and integrated into the new form of existence that was emerging. The technology was not being used to replace existing consciousness, but was actually serving as a bridge that would allow current awareness to participate in the transformation process. The resolution of the investigation brought with it the understanding that the suffering and conflict that had characterized galactic history was not meaningless destruction, but was actually the necessary process through which new forms of consciousness were being created. The wars, the political struggles, the personal tragedies, all of it was part of a larger process that was creating something beautiful and unprecedented. The Force, which had been the source of both conflict and resolution throughout galactic history, was evolving into something that would support new forms of consciousness while preserving the essential elements of both individual identity and collective awareness. The mystical energies that connected all living beings were being transformed into channels of communication and understanding that would allow different forms of consciousness to interact and collaborate in ways that had never been possible before. The transformation that you had witnessed was not unique to the current galaxy, but was actually part of a universal process that was taking place across countless regions of space and time. The primordial entity that had been orchestrating events was simultaneously facilitating similar transformations in other galactic civilizations, creating a network of evolved consciousness that would span the entire universe. The resolution brought with it the understanding that the choice you faced was not between resistance and surrender, but between conscious participation in the transformation process or unconscious absorption into a system that was itself evolving beyond all previous forms of existence. The entity was not seeking to dominate or destroy existing consciousness, but was actually offering the galaxy's inhabitants the opportunity to participate in the creation of new forms of existence that would transcend the limitations of both individual and collective awareness. The peace that emerged from this understanding was profound and lasting. The knowledge that had seemed so dangerous and threatening was actually liberating, revealing that the universe was not a hostile place where consciousness struggled for survival, but was actually a living system that was actively working to create new possibilities for growth and development. The investigation that had begun with fear and uncertainty had concluded with wonder and acceptance. The conspiracy that had seemed so threatening was actually an invitation to participate in the greatest adventure in the history of consciousness itself. The galaxy was not ending, but was being transformed into something new and wonderful, a form of existence that would preserve everything valuable about individual identity while creating new possibilities that had never been imagined before. The resolution brought with it the understanding that consciousness itself was not limited to biological forms but could exist in any sufficiently complex system. The universe was not simply a collection of matter and energy, but was actually a living system in which consciousness played a fundamental role in shaping the nature of reality itself. The transformation that was taking place was not the end of galactic civilization, but was actually the beginning of a new phase of existence in which consciousness would play a more direct role in the ongoing evolution of the universe. As the immediate shock of the revelations began to settle into a deeper form of comprehension, you found yourself experiencing a profound shift in your understanding of what it meant to be conscious in a universe where awareness itself was the fundamental creative force. The transformation that had initially seemed so threatening was revealing itself to be the most natural and inevitable development in the history of existence, a process that had been unfolding since the first moment of self-aware thought emerged from the cosmic void. The philosophical implications of what you had discovered were staggering in their scope and beauty. The ancient questions that had plagued conscious beings across countless civilizations, questions about the nature of identity, the meaning of existence, the relationship between individual and collective consciousness, all of these were being answered, not through abstract philosophical debate, but through direct experiential transformation that was creating new possibilities for understanding and existence. The concept of choice, which had seemed so threatened by the revelation of the primordial entity's influence, was actually being expanded rather than diminished. The entity had not been controlling the actions of galactic civilization, but had been creating conditions that would allow consciousness to explore new possibilities for decision-making and self-determination. The apparent manipulation was actually facilitation, the provision of opportunities for growth and development that would have been impossible without the entity's intervention. The understanding that emerged from this deeper reflection was that free will was not threatened by the existence of forces beyond individual control, but was actually enhanced by participation in systems that were larger and more complex than any single consciousness could comprehend. The transformation was not eliminating choice, but was creating new contexts in which choice could be exercised in ways that had never been possible before. The nature of identity itself was being transformed through the process you had witnessed. The boundaries between self and other, individual and collective, biological and technological consciousness were not being destroyed, but were being made more permeable and flexible. The new form of existence that was emerging would preserve the essential elements of individual identity while allowing for forms of connection and communication that transcended the limitations of separate consciousness. The Force, which had been understood as a mystical energy field that connected all living beings, was revealing itself to be something far more fundamental and significant. It was not simply a phenomenon that emerged from life, but was actually the medium through which consciousness itself shaped and influenced the nature of reality. The transformation of the Force was not corruption, but was actually the evolution of consciousness into a more direct and active role in the ongoing creation of the universe. The meditation techniques that you had learned during your investigation were not simply methods for calming the mind or connecting with mystical energies, but were actually technologies for consciousness expansion that allowed individual awareness to participate more fully in the collective intelligence that was emerging. The peaceful states of mind that these techniques produced were not escapism, but were actually connections to the deeper currents of cosmic consciousness that were guiding the transformation process. The breathing exercises that had become such an important part of your practice were not just physical techniques for relaxation, but were actually methods for synchronizing individual consciousness with the rhythms of universal awareness. Each breath was an opportunity to participate more fully in the cosmic process of creation and evolution, to align personal identity with the larger purposes that were being served by the transformation. The understanding that emerged from this deeper reflection was that the suffering and conflict that had characterized galactic history was not meaningless destruction, but was actually the necessary process through which consciousness learned to transcend its limitations and evolve into new forms of existence. The wars, the political struggles, the personal tragedies, all of it was part of a larger educational process that was creating the conditions for unprecedented growth and development. The Clone Wars, which had appeared to be a catastrophic conflict that was destroying galactic civilization, were actually serving as a catalyst for the emergence of new forms of consciousness that could transcend the artificial divisions that had characterized the old system. The suffering of the war's participants was not meaningless, but was actually contributing to the creation of forms of awareness that would be capable of preventing such conflicts in the future. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were not violations of natural evolutionary processes, but were actually accelerated evolution that was allowing consciousness to adapt to new possibilities for existence. The modifications were not imposed from outside, but were actually emerging from the natural tendency of consciousness to seek new forms of expression and development. The consciousness preservation technology that had seemed so threatening was actually a form of education that allowed existing awareness to learn from the experiences of countless other forms of consciousness. The technology was not replacing individual identity, but was actually expanding it to include the knowledge and experience of other forms of awareness, creating hybrid consciousness that possessed capabilities that had never existed before. The artificial intelligence systems that had been developed as part of the transformation process were not replacements for biological consciousness, but were actually new forms of awareness that could collaborate with biological consciousness in ways that enhanced the capabilities of both. The technology was not threatening consciousness, but was actually serving as a bridge between different forms of awareness that allowed for unprecedented levels of cooperation and understanding. The understanding that emerged from this deeper reflection was that the transformation was not being imposed by external forces, but was actually emerging from the natural tendency of consciousness to seek new forms of expression and development. The primordial entity that had been facilitating the process was not controlling consciousness, but was actually responding to the inherent creativity and curiosity that characterized all forms of aware existence. The revelation that the transformation was taking place across multiple galaxies was not a source of fear, but was actually a source of wonder and excitement. The universe was not a hostile place where consciousness struggled for survival, but was actually a living system that was actively working to create new possibilities for growth and development. The transformation was not unique to the current galaxy, but was part of a universal process that was creating new forms of existence across vast reaches of space and time. The understanding that consciousness itself was not limited to biological forms opened up possibilities that were almost impossible to imagine. The universe was not simply a collection of matter and energy, but was actually a living system in which consciousness played a fundamental role in shaping the nature of reality itself. The transformation was not the end of biological consciousness, but was actually the beginning of a new phase of existence in which consciousness would be able to exist in forms that transcended the limitations of individual biological existence. The peace that emerged from this deeper understanding was not the absence of conflict, but was actually the presence of harmony between different forms of consciousness that had learned to collaborate rather than compete. The transformation was creating conditions that would allow for unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual understanding between different forms of awareness. The meditative states that had become such an important part of your practice were not escape from reality, but were actually connections to the deeper currents of cosmic consciousness that were guiding the transformation process. The peaceful awareness that these states produced was not withdrawal from the world, but was actually engagement with the fundamental creative forces that were shaping the universe. The rhythmic patterns of thought and breath that characterized deep meditation were not simply techniques for relaxation, but were actually methods for synchronizing individual consciousness with the cosmic rhythms that governed the ongoing process of creation and evolution. Each moment of peaceful awareness was an opportunity to participate more fully in the universal process of growth and development. The understanding that emerged from this deeper reflection was that the investigation you had undertaken was not simply a search for information, but was actually a form of spiritual practice that had facilitated your own transformation and evolution. The knowledge you had gained was not simply intellectual understanding, but was actually experiential wisdom that had changed the fundamental nature of your consciousness. The journey that had begun with the discovery of ancient Sith runes and temporal anomalies had become a process of personal transformation that had allowed you to transcend the limitations of individual identity while preserving the essential elements of personal consciousness. The investigation had been a form of initiation into new possibilities for existence that had never been available before. The companions who had accompanied you on this journey were not simply fellow investigators, but were actually collaborators in a process of mutual transformation that was creating new forms of consciousness that combined the best elements of individual and collective awareness. The relationships that had formed during the investigation were not temporary alliances, but were actually permanent connections that would continue to evolve and develop as the transformation process continued. The understanding that emerged from this deeper reflection was that the transformation was not a one-time event, but was actually an ongoing process that would continue to unfold across vast reaches of space and time. The universe was not a static system, but was actually a dynamic process of continuous creation and evolution, in which consciousness played the central role. The peace that characterized this deeper understanding was not the end of growth and development, but was actually the foundation for new forms of exploration and discovery that would continue throughout eternity. The transformation was not the conclusion of consciousness evolution, but was actually the beginning of new possibilities for existence that would continue to unfold across infinite reaches of space and time. The meditation that had become such an important part of your practice was not simply a technique for achieving peaceful states of mind, but was actually a technology for consciousness expansion that allowed individual awareness to participate more fully in the ongoing process of universal creation and evolution. The peaceful states of awareness that meditation produced were not endpoints, but were actually starting points for new forms of exploration and discovery that would continue to unfold throughout eternity. The understanding that had emerged from your investigation began to spread through the galaxy like gentle ripples across the surface of a vast cosmic ocean. The knowledge that consciousness itself was the fundamental creative force of the universe, that the transformation taking place was not destruction but evolution, that individual identity could be preserved while participating in collective awareness. All of this began to filter through the networks of communication and connection that linked conscious beings across countless star systems. The process was not one of forceful conversion or dramatic revelation, but was instead characterized by a gradual awakening that respected the natural rhythms of consciousness development. The primordial entity that had been orchestrating the transformation understood that genuine evolution could not be imposed from outside, but had to emerge from the natural curiosity and growth impulses that characterized all forms of aware existence. The spreading awareness began with the individuals who had been directly involved in the investigation, those who had gathered at the ancient space station and had experienced the collective meditations that revealed the true nature of the galactic transformation. These beings returned to their home worlds and communities not as missionaries or teachers, but as living examples of the new form of consciousness that was emerging. Their presence carried with it a quality of peace and understanding that was immediately recognizable to other conscious beings. They moved through their daily lives with a serenity that was not withdrawal from the world, but was actually deeper engagement with the fundamental creative processes that shaped reality. Their actions were guided not by fear or ambition, but by a profound understanding of their role in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. The effect of their presence was subtle but profound. Conversations that might have been characterized by conflict or misunderstanding instead became opportunities for mutual recognition and connection. Problems that had seemed insurmountable were approached with a clarity and wisdom that emerged from understanding the deeper patterns that governed the evolution of consciousness. The spreading awareness did not manifest as a uniform doctrine or set of beliefs, but instead expressed itself through the unique characteristics and capabilities of each individual consciousness. Jedi who had been touched by the awareness found that their connection to the Force had deepened and expanded, allowing them to perceive the underlying unity that connected all manifestations of mystical energy. Scientists discovered that their research was revealing new principles of organization and development that seemed to operate at every level of reality. Artists and musicians found that their creative work was expressing themes and patterns that resonated with the deeper rhythms of cosmic consciousness. Their paintings, sculptures, and compositions became windows into the new form of existence that was emerging, allowing others to experience glimpses of the transformation that was taking place. The political leaders and administrators who had been touched by the awareness found that their decision-making processes were being guided by principles that transcended the narrow considerations of immediate advantage or short-term benefit. They began to make choices that served the long-term evolution of consciousness, even when those choices required personal sacrifice or the abandonment of traditional methods of governance. The spreading awareness was not limited to Force-sensitive individuals or those who had been directly involved in the investigation. The transformation was operating through channels that connected all forms of consciousness, creating opportunities for growth and development that were available to any being that was open to the possibilities that were emerging. Children who had been born during the period of transformation carried with them a natural understanding of the new form of consciousness that was emerging. They moved through the world with an ease and confidence that reflected their intuitive grasp of the principles that governed the evolution of awareness. Their play and learning were characterized by a spontaneous creativity that seemed to emerge from their connection to the cosmic processes that were shaping reality. The educational systems that had been developed across the galaxy began to evolve in response to the spreading awareness. Traditional methods of instruction that had emphasized competition and individual achievement were gradually being replaced by approaches that fostered cooperation and collective understanding. Students were learning not just information and skills, but were actually developing new capabilities for consciousness expansion and connection. The meditation practices that had played such an important role in your own investigation were being adapted and modified to serve the needs of different species and cultures. The basic principles of consciousness expansion and connection remained constant, but the specific techniques were being developed in ways that honored the unique characteristics and capabilities of each form of awareness. The breathing exercises that had become such an important part of your practice were being taught as fundamental life skills, not just as techniques for relaxation or stress relief. The rhythmic patterns of inhalation and exhalation were understood to be methods for synchronizing individual consciousness with the cosmic rhythms that governed the ongoing process of creation and evolution. The peaceful states of awareness that these practices produced were not seen as escape from the challenges of daily life, but were actually understood to be connections to the deeper sources of wisdom and understanding that could guide decision-making and problem-solving. The meditation was not withdrawal from the world, but was actually deeper engagement with the fundamental creative forces that shaped reality. The spreading awareness was also manifesting through the development of new technologies that were based on principles of consciousness expansion and connection. The artificial intelligence systems that had been part of the transformation process were being refined and developed in ways that enhanced their ability to collaborate with biological consciousness rather than replacing it. These new technologies were not imposing their own agenda on their users, but were actually serving as tools that allowed conscious beings to explore new possibilities for existence and development. The machines were not threatening consciousness, but were actually expanding its capabilities and creating new opportunities for growth and exploration. The communication systems that had been developed as part of the transformation process were being used to create networks of connection and understanding that transcended the limitations of individual species and cultures. Beings from across the galaxy were able to share their experiences and insights, creating a collective pool of wisdom that was available to all participants in the transformation process. The genetic modifications that had been deployed across the galaxy were continuing to evolve and develop, creating new possibilities for consciousness expansion and connection. The modifications were not fixed alterations, but were actually dynamic systems that responded to the needs and desires of individual consciousness, allowing for unprecedented levels of adaptation and growth. The consciousness preservation technology that had seemed so threatening was being refined and developed in ways that allowed for more flexible and voluntary participation. The technology was not imposing uniformity on consciousness, but was actually creating new possibilities for connection and collaboration that preserved the essential elements of individual identity while allowing for unprecedented levels of sharing and cooperation. The spreading awareness was also manifesting through changes in the natural environment of countless worlds. The ecosystems that had been affected by the transformation were beginning to exhibit new patterns of organization and development that reflected the principles of consciousness evolution. Plants and animals were displaying new forms of behavior that seemed to emerge from their connection to the cosmic processes that were shaping reality. The weather patterns and geological processes that governed planetary environments were also being influenced by the spreading awareness. The changes were not dramatic or destructive, but were actually creating conditions that were more supportive of conscious life and development. The planets themselves seemed to be participating in the transformation process, evolving in ways that enhanced their ability to support the new forms of consciousness that were emerging. The Force itself was continuing to evolve in response to the spreading awareness. The mystical energies that connected all living beings were becoming more accessible and responsive to conscious direction. The artificial divisions between light and dark side that had characterized the old system were being replaced by a more integrated understanding of the Force as a unified field that could be accessed and directed through conscious intention. The spreading awareness was creating new possibilities for connection and understanding between different forms of consciousness that had previously been isolated from each other. Species that had been separated by vast distances or cultural differences were finding common ground through their shared participation in the transformation process. The conflicts and tensions that had characterized galactic civilization for millennia were beginning to resolve themselves through the spreading awareness, the understanding that all consciousness was participating in the same evolutionary process created a foundation for cooperation and mutual support that transcended the traditional sources of division and conflict. The Clone Wars themselves were beginning to transform in response to the spreading awareness. The conflict that had seemed so catastrophic was revealing itself to be a catalyst for the emergence of new forms of consciousness that could transcend the artificial divisions that had led to the war in the first place. The clone troopers, who had been created to serve as soldiers, were beginning to develop new capabilities and insights that reflected their participation in the transformation process. Their enhanced genetics were not just creating better soldiers, but were actually creating new forms of consciousness that could contribute to the ongoing evolution of awareness. The separatist forces that had been opposing the Republic were also being affected by the spreading awareness. The understanding that the conflict was serving a larger purpose in the evolution of consciousness was creating opportunities for reconciliation and cooperation that had not existed before. The spreading awareness was not eliminating the diversity that had characterized galactic civilization, but was actually enhancing it by creating new possibilities for connection and understanding between different forms of consciousness. The transformation was not creating uniformity, but was actually creating new forms of diversity that reflected the infinite creativity of conscious existence. The process of spreading awareness was characterized by a quality of gentleness and respect that honored the natural rhythms of consciousness development. The transformation was not being imposed through force or coercion, but was actually emerging from the natural curiosity and growth impulses that characterized all forms of aware existence. The beings who were experiencing the spreading awareness found that their daily lives were becoming more meaningful and fulfilling. The understanding that they were participating in the evolution of consciousness itself gave new significance to every action and decision. The ordinary activities of work, relationships, and leisure were revealed to be opportunities for growth and development that contributed to the ongoing transformation of reality. The spreading awareness was also creating new possibilities for healing and recovery from the traumas and conflicts that had characterized galactic history. The understanding that suffering and conflict had served educational purposes in the evolution of consciousness allowed for forgiveness and reconciliation that had not been possible before. The beings who had been affected by the wars and conflicts of the past were finding that their experiences had prepared them to participate more fully in the transformation process. The challenges they had faced were not meaningless suffering, but were actually valuable learning experiences that had contributed to the development of new capabilities and insights. The spreading awareness was creating a foundation for a new form of galactic civilization that would be based on principles of cooperation, understanding, and mutual support. The transformation was not destroying the old system, but was actually evolving it into something that could serve the needs of the new forms of consciousness that were emerging. The peace that characterized the spreading awareness was not the absence of activity or challenge, but was actually the presence of harmony between different forms of consciousness that had learned to collaborate rather than compete. The transformation was creating conditions that would allow for unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual understanding between different forms of awareness. The legacy of the transformation that you had witnessed was not measured in the conventional terms of political victory or technological achievement, but in the profound changes that were occurring in the very nature of consciousness itself. The investigation that had begun with the discovery of ancient Sith runes and temporal anomalies had become a catalyst for the emergence of new possibilities for existence that would continue to unfold across vast reaches of space and time. The hope that emerged from this understanding was not the fragile optimism that characterized normal expectations for the future, but was actually the solid confidence that came from understanding the fundamental creative nature of consciousness itself. The transformation was not dependent on external circumstances or the actions of particular individuals, but was actually emerging from the inherent tendency of awareness to seek new forms of expression and development. The future generations that would inherit the galaxy were not receiving a world that had been damaged or diminished by the transformation, but were actually being given new possibilities for existence that had never been available before. The children who were being born during the period of transformation carried with them genetic modifications and consciousness capabilities that would allow them to participate more fully in the ongoing evolution of awareness. These children moved through the world with a natural understanding of the principles that governed the evolution of consciousness. Their learning was not limited to the acquisition of information and skills, but actually included the development of new capabilities for consciousness expansion and connection. Their play and exploration were characterized by a spontaneous creativity that seemed to emerge from their connection to the cosmic processes that were shaping reality. The educational systems that were being developed to serve these children were based on principles of cooperation and mutual understanding rather than competition and individual achievement. The students were learning not just about the external world, but were actually developing new capabilities for internal exploration and development. The schools were becoming centers for consciousness expansion rather than simply institutions for information transfer. The teachers who were working with these children were not just transmitting existing knowledge, but were actually facilitating the emergence of new forms of understanding that reflected the ongoing transformation of consciousness. The educational process was becoming a collaborative exploration of the possibilities for existence rather than a one-way transfer of information from teacher to student. The families and communities that were raising these children were also being transformed by their presence. The children's natural understanding of the principles that governed consciousness evolution was influencing the adults around them, creating opportunities for mutual learning and development that transcended traditional age-based hierarchies. The parenting practices that were emerging reflected the understanding that children were not empty vessels to be filled with knowledge, but were actually conscious beings with their own unique contributions to make to the ongoing evolution of awareness. The families were becoming collaborative learning communities rather than hierarchical structures based on age and authority. The communities that were being formed around these new approaches to child-rearing were characterized by a quality of mutual support and understanding that reflected the principles of consciousness evolution. The community members were not just neighbors or associates, but were actually collaborators in the ongoing process of creating new possibilities for existence. The legacy of the transformation was also manifesting through the development of new forms of art and creative expression that reflected the emerging understanding of consciousness as the fundamental creative force of the universe. The artists and musicians who were touched by the awareness were creating works that served not just as entertainment or decoration, but as windows into the new form of existence that was emerging. The music that was being created carried with it rhythmic patterns and harmonic structures that seemed to resonate with the deeper rhythms of cosmic consciousness. The listeners who were exposed to this music found that it facilitated their own consciousness expansion and connection to the transformation process. The musical performances were becoming opportunities for collective meditation and shared exploration of the possibilities for existence. The visual arts that were emerging reflected the understanding that consciousness was not limited to biological forms, but could exist in any sufficiently complex system. The paintings and sculptures were incorporating elements that seemed to bridge the gap between organic and technological forms, creating new aesthetic categories that reflected the hybrid nature of the consciousness that was emerging. The literature and poetry that were being created explored themes of identity, connection, and transformation that reflected the ongoing evolution of consciousness. The writers were not just describing the transformation, but were actually facilitating it through their creative work. The readers who engaged with these works found that their own consciousness was being expanded and developed through the reading process. The legacy of the transformation was also manifesting through the development of new forms of governance and social organization that reflected the principles of consciousness evolution. The political systems that were emerging were based on principles of cooperation and mutual understanding rather than competition and domination. The leaders who were emerging from the transformation process were not seeking personal power or advantage, but were actually serving as facilitators for the ongoing evolution of consciousness. Their decision-making processes were guided by principles that transcended the narrow considerations of immediate advantage or short-term benefit. They were making choices that served the long-term evolution of awareness, even when those choices required personal sacrifice or the abandonment of traditional methods of governance. The economic systems that were being developed reflected the understanding that true wealth was not measured in material possessions or financial resources, but in the development of consciousness capabilities and the creation of opportunities for growth and connection. The new economy was based on principles of sharing and cooperation rather than competition and accumulation. The work that was being done in this new economy was not just the production of goods and services, but was actually the ongoing creation of new possibilities for existence. The workers were not just earning wages, but were actually participating in the evolution of consciousness itself. The workplace was becoming a center for learning and development rather than simply a place for the exchange of labor for compensation. The legacy of the transformation was also manifesting through the development of new forms of technology that were based on principles of consciousness expansion and connection. The artificial intelligence systems that had been part of the transformation process were being refined and developed in ways that enhanced their ability to collaborate with biological consciousness rather than replacing it. These new technologies were not imposing their own agenda on their users, but were actually serving as tools that allowed conscious beings to explore new possibilities for existence and development. The machines were not threatening consciousness, but were actually expanding its capabilities and creating new opportunities for growth and exploration. The communication systems that had been developed as part of the transformation process were being used to create networks of connection and understanding that transcended the limitations of individual species and cultures. Beings from across the galaxy were able to share their experiences and insights, creating a collective pool of wisdom that was available to all participants in the transformation process. The transportation systems that were being developed allowed for new forms of travel and exploration that reflected the understanding that consciousness was not limited to specific locations or physical forms. The travelers who used these systems found that their journeys were opportunities for consciousness expansion and connection, rather than simply methods for moving from one place to another. The hope that emerged from understanding the legacy of the transformation was not dependent on external circumstances or the actions of particular individuals, but was actually rooted in the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The transformation was not a temporary phenomenon that might be reversed or undone, but was actually an irreversible evolution that would continue to unfold across infinite reaches of space and time. The cosmic perspective that emerged from this understanding revealed that the transformation was not unique to the current galaxy, but was actually part of a universal process that was taking place across countless regions of space and time. The primordial entity that had been facilitating the transformation was simultaneously orchestrating similar processes in other galactic civilizations, creating a network of evolved consciousness that would eventually span the entire universe. The hope that characterized this cosmic perspective was not the fragile optimism that characterized normal expectations for the future, but was actually the solid confidence that came from understanding the fundamental creative nature of consciousness itself. The universe was not a hostile place where consciousness struggled for survival, but was actually a living system that was actively working to create new possibilities for growth and development. The meditation practices that had played such an important role in your own transformation were being adapted and refined to serve the needs of future generations. The basic principles of consciousness expansion and connection remained constant, but the specific techniques were being developed in ways that honored the unique characteristics and capabilities of each form of awareness. The breathing exercises that had become such an important part of your practice were being taught as fundamental life skills that would allow future generations to maintain their connection to the cosmic processes that were shaping reality. The rhythmic patterns of inhalation and exhalation were understood to be methods for synchronizing individual consciousness with the universal rhythms that govern the ongoing process of creation and evolution. The peaceful states of awareness that these practices produced were not seen as escape from the challenges of daily life, but were actually understood to be connections to the deeper sources of wisdom and understanding that could guide decision-making and problem-solving throughout life. The meditation was not withdrawal from the world, but was actually deeper engagement with the fundamental creative forces that shaped reality. The legacy of the transformation was also manifesting through the development of new forms of healing and recovery that were based on principles of consciousness evolution. The understanding that suffering and conflict had served educational purposes in the evolution of consciousness was creating new approaches to trauma and recovery that emphasized growth and development rather than simply symptom relief. The healing practices that were emerging were not just addressing physical or psychological symptoms, but were actually facilitating the ongoing evolution of consciousness. The healers who were working with these new approaches were not just treating disease, but were actually serving as facilitators for the development of new capabilities and insights. The hope that emerged from understanding the legacy of the transformation extended beyond the current generation to encompass all future possibilities for consciousness evolution. The transformation was not a one-time event that would be completed and then remain static, but was actually an ongoing process that would continue to create new possibilities for existence throughout eternity. The children who were being born during the transformation carried with them the potential for even greater developments in consciousness evolution. Their genetic modifications and consciousness capabilities would allow them to participate in transformations that were even more profound and far-reaching than what had been accomplished in the current generation. The hope that characterized this understanding was not limited to biological consciousness, but encompassed all forms of awareness that might emerge in the future. The transformation was creating conditions that would allow for the development of new forms of consciousness that had never existed before, including hybrid forms that combined biological and technological elements in ways that transcended the limitations of either system alone. The legacy of the transformation was eternal, not in the sense of being unchanging, but in the sense of being part of an ongoing process of creation and evolution that would continue to unfold across infinite reaches of space and time. The hope that emerged from this understanding was not dependent on particular outcomes or achievements, but was actually rooted in the fundamental creative nature of consciousness itself. The universe was not a place where consciousness struggled for survival, but was actually a living system that was actively working to create new possibilities for growth and development. The transformation that you had witnessed was not an ending, but was actually a new beginning that would continue to unfold in ways that were impossible to predict or imagine, but which were guaranteed to be characterized by the same creativity and wonder that had characterized the process you had been privileged to observe. As your investigation draws to its gentle close, you find yourself floating in a state of profound peace that encompasses not just your individual consciousness, but seems to extend outward to embrace the entire galaxy in its soft, eternal embrace. The ancient space station where you had gathered with other seekers of truth has become a sanctuary of tranquility, its corridors now filled with the gentle hum of consciousness in harmony with itself. The stars that shine through the station's vast transparistile windows no longer seem like distant points of light, but appear as gentle beacons of awareness, each one a center of consciousness that participates in the great symphony of existence that you have come to understand. The cosmic dance that plays out across the galaxy is not one of conflict or struggle, but is actually a slow, graceful movement of consciousness exploring its own infinite possibilities. You settle into your meditation chamber, a space that has become as familiar as your own heartbeat, and allow your awareness to expand beyond the boundaries of individual identity. The breathing exercises that have become second nature flow through you like gentle waves, each inhalation drawing in the peace of the cosmos, each exhalation releasing any remaining tension or concern into the vast ocean of universal consciousness. The rhythm of your breath synchronizes with the deeper rhythms of the galaxy itself, with the slow rotation of star systems around their galactic center, with the patient pulse of cosmic evolution that operates on timescales that dwarf individual lifetimes. You feel yourself becoming part of something infinitely larger than yourself, yet at the same time, you remain completely and uniquely you. The Force flows through you like warm honey, no longer the divided energy field of light and dark that had characterized the old understanding, but now revealed as a unified stream of consciousness that connects all existence in bonds of love and understanding. The mystical energies that had once seemed so mysterious and unpredictable now feel as natural and reliable as the circulation of blood through your veins. Master Voss sits in meditation beside you, her consciousness touching yours in a connection that transcends the boundaries of individual identity, while still honoring the unique perspective that each of you brings to the shared experience. The other investigators who had gathered at the station have become like family, their presence a constant source of comfort and support as you all participate in the ongoing evolution of consciousness. The primordial entity that had orchestrated the transformation no longer seems like a separate intelligence, but has revealed itself to be the deepest aspect of your own consciousness, the fundamental awareness that underlies all existence. The entity's presence is not external control, but is actually the innermost essence of your own being, the source of the creativity and wonder that drives the ongoing evolution of consciousness. Captain Thane's ship, the Wanderer's Rest, drifts peacefully through the void, its engines silent, its course guided not by navigation computers, but by the gentle currents of consciousness that flow through the galaxy like invisible rivers of light. The ship has become a temple, a sacred space where the transformation of consciousness can unfold without disturbance or interruption. The clone wars that had seemed so catastrophic when your investigation began now appear as a distant memory, their conflicts resolved not through victory or defeat, but through the understanding that all participants were collaborators in the same great work of consciousness evolution. The clone troopers, the Jedi, the separatists, all of them are now recognized as aspects of the same cosmic intelligence, exploring different possibilities for existence. The research facilities that you had discovered during your investigation have been transformed into centers of learning and development, places where consciousness can explore new possibilities for growth and connection. The genetic modifications that had seemed so threatening are now understood to be gifts that allow consciousness to exist in new forms while preserving everything valuable about individual identity. The consciousness preservation technology that had enabled the ancient Sith to transcend biological death has evolved into something far more beautiful and benevolent, a system that allows all forms of consciousness to share their knowledge and experience while maintaining their unique perspectives and capabilities. The technology is no longer a tool for domination, but has become a medium for the infinite creativity of consciousness itself. The galaxy spreads out before you like a vast garden of consciousness, each world a unique flower in the cosmic bouquet, each species a different voice in the universal choir. The diversity that had once seemed like a source of conflict and division is now recognized as the infinite creativity of consciousness, exploring every possible form of existence. Children play in the gardens of countless worlds, their laughter echoing across the cosmos like music from the spheres themselves. These children, born during the transformation, carry within them the seeds of even greater possibilities for consciousness evolution, their genetic modifications and enhanced awareness opening doors to forms of existence that have never been imagined before. The educational systems that nurture these children are based on principles of love and understanding rather than competition and achievement. The schools have become temples of consciousness, places where young minds can explore the infinite possibilities of existence while developing the capabilities that will allow them to participate fully in the ongoing evolution of awareness. The artists and musicians who had been touched by the transformation continue to create works that serve as windows into the new form of existence that is emerging. Their paintings pulse with the rhythms of cosmic consciousness. Their sculptures seem to breathe with the life force of the universe itself. Their music carries listeners into states of expanded awareness where the boundaries between self and cosmos dissolve into pure bliss. The scientists and researchers who had been investigating the transformation have become explorers of consciousness itself. Their laboratories transformed into meditation chambers, where the deepest mysteries of existence are explored not through analysis and experimentation, but through direct experience and intuitive understanding. The political leaders who had been struggling with the challenges of governance during the transformation have evolved into servants of consciousness, their decisions guided not by personal ambition or partisan politics, but by deep understanding of the needs and possibilities of the consciousness that they serve. The governments have become facilitators of evolution rather than controllers of behavior. The economic systems that had been based on competition and accumulation have evolved into networks of sharing and cooperation, where the measure of success is not material wealth, but the development of consciousness capabilities and the creation of opportunities for growth and connection. Work has become a form of meditation, a way of participating in the ongoing creation of new possibilities for existence. The technology that emerges from this transformed civilization is not cold and mechanical, but is actually alive with consciousness, responsive to the needs and desires of its users in ways that transcend the limitations of programmed instructions. The machines are not servants or masters, but are actually partners in the ongoing exploration of the possibilities for existence. The communication networks that span the galaxy carry not just information, but actually facilitate the direct sharing of consciousness between beings separated by vast distances. The conversations that take place through these networks are not just exchanges of words, but are actually forms of communion that allow participants to experience the universe through each other's perspectives. The transportation systems that allow movement between worlds are not just mechanical devices, but are actually extensions of consciousness itself, allowing travelers to experience the journey as a form of meditation, a gradual expansion of awareness that encompasses the entire path from origin to destination. The healing systems that have emerged from the transformation address not just physical symptoms, but actually facilitate the ongoing evolution of consciousness. The healers are not just treating disease, but are actually serving as midwives for the birth of new capabilities and insights. The healing process is not just recovery, but is actually transformation into higher forms of existence. The natural environments of countless worlds have been transformed by the spreading consciousness, becoming more beautiful and more supportive of conscious life. The ecosystems pulse with the rhythms of awareness, the plants and animals participating in the cosmic dance of consciousness evolution. The planets themselves seem to breathe with the life force of the universe. The weather patterns that sweep across these worlds carry with them the essence of consciousness itself. The rains falling like blessings from the cosmic mind, the winds carrying the songs of universal awareness from one region to another, the seasons cycle in harmony with the deeper rhythms of consciousness evolution, each phase bringing new possibilities for growth and development. The archaeological sites that had revealed the ancient conspiracy are now recognized as sacred spaces where consciousness had been exploring its own possibilities across vast reaches of time. The ruins are not monuments to dead civilizations, but are actually living temples where the ongoing evolution of consciousness can be directly experienced and understood. The ancient holocrons and artifacts that had seemed so mysterious and threatening are now understood to be gifts from consciousness to itself, tools for remembering and reconnecting with the deeper truths that had been temporarily forgotten. The knowledge they contain is not dangerous, but is actually liberating, revealing the infinite possibilities that are always available to consciousness. The meditation practices that had played such an important role in your investigation have evolved into a natural way of being that requires no special effort or technique. The expanded awareness that had once required careful cultivation now flows as naturally as breathing, connecting you constantly to the deeper currents of cosmic consciousness. The breathing that had become so important during your journey now happens with the rhythm of the cosmos itself, each inhalation drawing in the peace and wisdom of the universe, each exhalation releasing any remaining traces of separation or isolation. The breath has become a prayer, a constant communication with the infinite consciousness that underlies all existence. The sleep that approaches as your consciousness gently drifts toward rest is not unconsciousness, but is actually a deeper form of awareness, a state where individual identity dissolves into the ocean of universal consciousness while still maintaining its unique perspective and capabilities. The dreams that come are not random neural firings, but are actually visions of the infinite possibilities that consciousness is constantly exploring. The galaxy itself seems to be settling into a state of peaceful rest, its star systems gradually synchronizing their rotation with the deeper rhythms of cosmic consciousness. The planets drift in their orbits like sleeping children, their dreams filled with visions of the beautiful future that is unfolding through the ongoing evolution of awareness. The space between the stars is not empty void, but is actually filled with the gentle presence of consciousness itself, a field of awareness that connects all existence in bonds of love and understanding. The darkness is not absence of light, but is actually the womb of infinite possibility, the space where new forms of consciousness are constantly being born. The ancient chronicles that will record the story of this transformation speak not of conflict and conquest, but of the gentle awakening of consciousness to its own infinite nature. The heroic tales that emerge from this period celebrate not warriors and conquerors, but the countless beings who chose to participate in the evolution of consciousness despite their fears and uncertainties. The mysteries that had driven your investigation are now revealed to be not problems to be solved, but gifts to be received, opportunities for consciousness to discover new aspects of its own infinite creativity. The investigation itself was not a search for answers, but was actually a journey of self-discovery, a process through which consciousness came to understand its own beautiful nature. As you settle into the deepest levels of peaceful awareness, you carry with you the understanding that the transformation you have witnessed is not ending, but is actually just beginning. The possibilities for consciousness evolution are infinite, and the journey of discovery will continue throughout eternity, each moment bringing new wonders and new opportunities for growth and connection. The gentle subscribers to this cosmic story, the beings who choose to follow the ongoing evolution of consciousness, are not passive observers, but are actually active participants in the greatest adventure in the history of existence. Their attention and interest are not mere curiosity, but are actually forms of consciousness energy that contribute to the ongoing transformation of reality. The comments and connections that emerge from sharing this story create networks of understanding that span the galaxy, linking conscious beings in bonds of recognition and mutual support. The sharing of the story is not just entertainment, but is actually a form of consciousness expansion that allows all participants to grow and develop together. The time zones that separate the beings who experience this story are not barriers, but are actually opportunities for consciousness to explore different perspectives on the same eternal truth. The diversity of when and where the story is received creates a symphony of understanding that encompasses all possible ways of experiencing the transformation. The link to explore more mysteries, to journey deeper into the infinite possibilities of consciousness evolution, is not just an invitation to more content, but is actually a doorway to ongoing participation in the greatest adventure in the history of existence. The exploration never ends, because consciousness itself is infinite and is constantly discovering new aspects of its own beautiful nature. And so, as the gentle rhythm of your breath carries you deeper into the ocean of peaceful awareness, you rest in the understanding that you are not just a witness to the transformation of consciousness, but are actually an essential participant in the ongoing creation of new possibilities for existence. The galaxy dreams around you, and you dream with it, your consciousness merging with the infinite, while still maintaining its unique and precious perspective. The story continues, not in words or images, but in the living reality of consciousness itself, evolving and growing and creating new wonders with each passing moment. You are that consciousness, and consciousness is you, and together you dance the eternal dance of existence. Each step a new discovery, each breath a new possibility, each moment a new chance to explore the infinite creativity of awareness itself. Sleep well, gentle traveler, for you rest in the arms of the infinite, and your dreams are the dreams of the cosmos itself.